Hey guys, I'm Yurouzi. This is the part 11 of What If Naruto and Team 7 was actually trained by Kakashi. Kakashi survived his losses in spirit as well as in body, and having learned both wisdom and intellect from his experiences, he now seeks to pass those traits on to his students. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. 42. Leaving home. It had taken Naruto almost an hour to evade Kakashi, but in the end, the photo was safely delivered to Anko, who haggled a bit before settling for giving Naruto 80% of the betting pool before he left. From there, Naruto had run to a clothing shop that offered good prices to him, grabbing a few pairs of shorts and a few lightweight shirts. He then ran to a supply store to grab some basic food and a canteen. Finally, a trip to a weapon shop let him load his pouch with spare kunai and a few storage scrolls to pack with. At each one, the shopkeepers had been remarkably friendly, and Naruto suspected the clothing shop had given him a discount. It was a surprise, but a pleasant one, so he smiled and moved along. Packing had been depressingly easy. One scroll to carry the supplies needed to maintain his swords and to keep his kunai sharp, along with a few heavier sets of clothes, in case his missions had him leave the desert. A second scroll was loaded with a few luxuries, such as a selection of his favorite cup ramen, his toothbrush, and his sleeping hat and pajamas. Everything else was left where it was, except for his houseplants, which he put out onto the windowsill so Sakura could pick them up later. He looked at his home, already feeling empty despite his presence, and sighed. Without being around to pay the rent, the apartment would probably revert back to the pool of subsidized living quarters the village held for those in need. If so, his possessions would be packed and placed in storage until he returned, or until the village believed him dead. It was more efficient that way, with how many shinobi risked life and death while living in such housing. That thought brought no comfort to him. Efficient just meant impersonal. His window slid aside, and Guy leaned in, giving Naruto a cheerful smile. Found them, he said, holding out two swords, carefully wrapped in soft cloth. Naruto took them and started to look them over. He noted that the chakra metal was untouched, but there were a few abrasions and marks on the untreated metal. He rubbed at them softly with the cloth. He was so focused on the blades that he didn't realize Guy had entered the room fully until the big man laid a hand on his shoulder, causing him to flinch slightly. "Something wrong, Naruto?" asked Guy, his voice friendly and calm. It took Naruto a few moments to reply, and when he did, it was almost a whisper. "I've left before, but now. This may be the last time I see this place. I miss it already, and I haven't even left." Guy nodded sagely, then gave Naruto his best non-sparkly smile. He'd volunteered to drop off the swords in Kakashi's place, because as much as Guy appreciated his friend, he suspected Kakashi could never really understand homesickness, having had no real home after the loss of his father. That is true, but there is a better way to think of it. You're not leaving home, you're having an adventure, one that you can tell all the little genin about when they ask you how you became Hokage. He gave Naruto a pat on the shoulder. All shinobi miss home. In truth, all warriors feel that pain. But what is the alternative? Stay at home, work in a shop maybe, or guard the village gates. Become a paper ninja, Naruto snorted. Exactly, said Guy. That's not your nature any more than it is mine. Don't think of this as leaving home, Naruto. Think of this as an opportunity to see some of the world before the mountain of paperwork that comes with the Hokage's hat cements you to his illustrious chair. Naruto grinned a little at that. He was not delusional, and he had noticed how literal that mountain could be. And he might have friends now, and teachers, and teammates, but he still wanted his face on that mountain of stone outside, paperwork and all. He picked up his bag, feeling a little less worried about the whole thing, and turned to leave, then stopped. "Hey, Guy-sensei, do me a favor and watch Kakashi-sensei, please. He was acting all weird and mopey earlier, and I don't want to come back to find out he drove Team 7 apart by being an emo crybaby." "Okay. Tell him those exact words if you have to." Guy laughed. "After the youthful chase you gave him turning in what my fellow jonin are already calling the glorious Naruto vengeance photo, I think he'll be fine, but don't worry, I'll make sure to stoke the fires of his youth so much he'll forget all about it." He said this in a remarkably restrained voice, and he gave Naruto a wink. "Youth," he said quietly, turning his usual battle cry into a haunting whisper. Naruto nodded and left his old apartment, his stride steady and a smile on his face. Naruto had to stop by Ichiraku's one last time before he left. He could hardly leave without one last glorious bowl to remember. The one with Gaara earlier hardly counted, he had been too busy setting the skittish boy at ease to really enjoy it. Apparently, everyone had figured as much, because there was a small crowd of his colleagues hovering around. Sakura was sitting on the ground, waving a small piece of string in front of Kiri and pulling it away whenever the cat started to move. Ino and Lee were thumb wrestling with a degree of effort that defied the simple nature of the game, and when Lee finally pinned Ino's thumb, Tenten rolled her eyes and passed Choji some money with a grumble as the larger boy cheered. To one side, Sasuke and Shino were quietly conversing with Shikamaru, who looked somewhat more focused than he usually got when off duty. On the other side, Niji and Kiba were having another quiet discussion with Hinata, who looked ready to bolt. Akamaru started to yap from his place on Kiba's head, and everyone fell quiet and turned to face him as he approached, their faces an odd mix of good cheer, concern, and interest. "Hey guys," he said, working to keep his voice even. "What's going on?" Sakura smiled at him. "Kakashi dropped by to let us know what's going on. You're going to be gone a long time. We're all here to see you off, Naruto." This did not get the reaction they expected. Naruto took a step back, his eyes wandering from face to face. "It's not a big deal," he said, his voice wavering slightly. "You don't have to be here, I'm sure you have better things too." His voice faded as the group shared a look, after which Sasuke walked over to Naruto's side. Then he punched the blonde in the arm. Hard. "Hey, Naruto," said Sasuke, smirking at his friend, "stop being so freaked out. You have friends, and friends say goodbye to one another before they go on a big trip." "We'll miss you," Hinata said timidly. She raised her hands, her fingers starting to tap each other, before she seemed to realize what she was doing and forced her arms back down. "Why?" asked Shino, adjusting his glasses. "Because it is the nature of any organized group dash." He stopped as Kiba put him in a friendly headlock and grinned at Naruto. "Let me translate for Stuffy here. You're one of us. You helped your team when that Gaara kid was gonna kill them, and you helped Hinata too. Even if we weren't cool before, we are now. So come have some of this slop you like so much already." Ino looked ready to speak when suddenly the group as a whole fell silent and still, staring over Naruto's shoulder. He turned and saw Gaara and his ANBU guard approaching along the street. The weasel-masked escort was pointing out various things, as if he was a tour guide more than a jailer, and Gaara was following the man's directions with, for him, a great deal of interest. It was only when the two got within a few steps away that Weasel put a hand out and stopped Gaara, who first glanced at the man, then looked forward and froze. The silence on the street was chilling as the entire group glared at the Suna shinobi. Some, like Hinata, were fearful, and some, like Kiba, were belligerent, but every one of them glared as hard as they could at the cause of their goodbyes. Everyone but Naruto, who smiled and walked over to the red-haired boy. His movements were easy and slow, as non-threatening as any shinobi could be, and he stopped just out of reach to give the boy a nod. "Hey, Gaara. They giving you the tour?" Gaara nodded silently, his eyes darting from face to face. He opened his mouth to speak, then let it slowly close as his words faltered under the strength of the group's combined glares, their disdain, their hate. His eyes kept moving until they fell upon the face of the girl with the pale eyes. She looked fit to cry just from his presence, and he was both proud and appalled that he now understood why. He stared at her, uncertain what he could say to her, to any of them, that could ever make those glares fade, and worst of all, he could understand why. "I would have killed them all for a monster's ability to pretend to care for me. I would have murdered them, slaughtered them. Even now, that girl's blood would be a part of my sand. I would have laughed at her cries of pain and terror. Laughed, and reached for more." Gaara always understood how to interact with others on an intellectual level. He was nothing if not observant. He simply had not bothered, when everyone was only worth whatever praise he could get from within. But now, in the face of understanding on an emotional level what he had become under the influence of the creature within him, he could not deny the painful truth that if he had not been a monster from birth, he had certainly become a monster by choice. People who suffered at the hands of monsters often became monster hunters. He did not notice Naruto had moved until the boy's arm draped softly over his shoulder, causing him to flinch slightly before he turned to face his, what? Counterpart? Fellow container? Friend? Never friend, came the voice in his mind, whispering the same dreadful words she always did, the same painful, terrible, accurate words he was so used to hearing. Her voice was quiet and distant, the lightest touch upon his mind where once it had been a shout strong enough to drown out the world. He may have saved you, but in the end, only one cares for you, and it is not any of them. If your own family would see you dead, what will they do to you? Gaara stiffened, feeling the urge to flee from the cold eyes watching him, only for Naruto to give him a pat on the back as he leaned in to whisper, "Remember what she does. Don't let her be the cause of your loneliness." Gaara looked at his friend, and nodded, focusing his will until he could barely hear Mother's whispers. "There is nothing I can do to redeem myself in their eyes, but there is something I must do, all the same." He opened his mouth to speak, but realized he was talking to the wrong person for what he needed to say. "I'm sorry," he said, facing the wall of furious silence. "I am sorry. My actions were terrible. Even if I never did any of it. I would have. I ask no forgiveness. I would not dare to ask. But it still needs to be said." He looked at each of them in turn, until he was once again looking at the girl with the pale eyes. "I'm sorry," he repeated, his vision wavering as tears long unshed began to gather in his eyes. The group's glares broke as they glanced at each other, evaluating. Gaara could see the calculation in their eyes, the uncertainty, the mistrust. He closed his eyes to their judgment, then opened them when one stepped forward, the boy with the furry coat and small dog on his head. The boy walked up and glared down at Gaara, who forced himself not to look away. The small dog on the boy's head sniffed a few times, then yapped once. The boy grunted in reply, and his arm lashed out at waist height and stopped halfway between them, his fist clenched tight. Gaara stared at him, confused, causing the boy to smirk. "It's called a fist bump," he said, nodding once. "You make a fist and lightly hit mine with it. It is a way some cool people acknowledge others. Friends, competitors, rivals. Whatever they are. Important thing is that they know it." His other arm came up to point a thumb at his canine passenger. "Akamaru says you smell different now, and you certainly sound different, with the sudden lack of being a murderous asshole. I'll trust my instincts on this and cut you some slack." Gaara stared at the boy for a moment, then hesitantly raised an arm and tapped the boy's fist with his own. This seemed to satisfy the boy, who grunted and gave him a nod before turning back to the food stand. The group was no longer glaring at him. They didn't seem happy with his presence, but they didn't seem to be focused on hating him. The pink-haired girl even managed to smile, as small and confused as that smile was. Gaara tried to smile back, but faltered when he realized the only sort of smile he knew was not the kind you share with people, but with victims. Naruto seemed to notice his uncertainty and gave him another pat on the back, gently nudging him towards the food stand. "The best way to get to know people is over a hot meal. We just ate here no more than an hour ago, Naruto." Naruto smiled and glanced at his friends. "Sometimes it's more about the company than the food." Gaara found himself being irresistibly drawn into the food stand, surrounded by people he didn't know, to eat food he didn't really care to eat, but he didn't resist all that hard. They were waiting for him as the sun started to set. Naruto approached at a healthy jog, still pulling on the strap to his backpack over his shoulders, trying to fit it around the green cloak he was wearing over his normal jumpsuit. He suspected that his temporary boss would appreciate knowing that Naruto was not a complete idiot when it came to stealth. Then he saw that aforementioned boss ahead, and his enthusiasm cooled significantly. Raza was talking with Orochimaru and the Hokage. Kankuro, Temari, and their sensei were all standing to one side, waiting quietly. Temari and the teacher, Baki, I think he was called, both looked at him with mild disinterest, but Kankuro smiled and gave Naruto a nod before returning to his own indifferent look. Naruto was rather surprised that they were so quiet, just before they were to return home, but he was beginning to suspect that Kazekage-sama, I need to get into that habit. Kazekage-sama was not the type to enjoy levity. Naruto walked up to them and joined the line they had formed, standing on one end next to Kankuro and adopting his most bored, disinterested, Iruka is explaining politics again look. He was amused to hear Temari snort, but Baki's lip curled up slightly as well, so Naruto figured he did the right thing. Orochimaru was the first of the higher ranks to notice Naruto's arrival, and the look of unmitigated glee he suddenly adopted was more than a little aggravating, as if the snake was waiting for his favorite pet to do a trick. The other leaders had not looked at him yet, so he rubbed some imaginary dust out of one eye with his middle finger. Temari snorted again, and he was sure he saw Kankuro smile for just a moment before he returned to normal, just in time for the Kazekage to turn and look in their direction. If Orochimaru looked like he was watching a pet doing a trick, Raza looked like he was watching a pet take a piddle on the carpet. "Genin Uzumaki," he said, his voice a dull growl. Naruto gave the man a proper salute, and Raza grunted in approval. "Your only task for now is to keep up with us. Falling behind means failure. Lose sight of us, and you'll be expected to carry on to Sunigakure on your own. Understood?" Naruto nodded and resisted the urge to snort in amusement at what surely had to be some sort of test. If the Kazekage wanted me dead, he would keep me close and then kill me when we got out of view, then put on an act of contrition when he got home, boo-hoo, so sorry, throw myself on your mercy, and so on. So he's going to try and lose me instead. Well, bring it, old man. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The Kazekage turned and started to move away from the others, and the other 3 Suna shinobi went with him, giving Naruto a professionally distant nod with the exception of Kankuro, who smirked and gave a quick thumbs up before taking off with the rest. Naruto smiled a bit at the discreet encouragement and started to follow. Orochimaru called out as Naruto left his home, his voice full of cheer. "Naruto-kun, be safe now. I want to see what happens next time we meet." Naruto refused to even acknowledge the snake. They had barely left the shadow of Konohagakure's gates when Temari set her fan on the ground and stood in Naruto's path, arms crossed. "What?" he politely asked. Temari snorted. "Carry my fan." "Bullshit." Temari's cold smile fell into her more customary scowl. "I am a blood relation to the Kazekage. I may be a genin, but I may as well be a princess by my homeland's standards. You will do as I say, Uzumaki, if you don't want us to consider the contract void." Naruto opened his mouth to object, then stopped when Raza came back to them. "Uzumaki," he said, his tone as dull as lead and just as heavy, "a genin is not required to follow the orders of another genin, regardless of their family relations." Naruto smirked at Temari, then froze when Raza continued. "Too bad you are not a genin. Not in my country, where you now serve. To us, you are no more than a civilian with some impressive skills. And my land has been ruled by an iron fist since my predecessor. In my land, shinobi outrank any non-shinobi, and may order all but the daimyo himself. So pick up the fan, Uzumaki." Naruto gave a perfunctory bow and made a hand seal. "You don't need a clone for this, Uzumaki," said the Kazekage, looking down at Naruto. Naruto sighed and bent to pick up the fan himself, and in doing so missed the glance the Kazekage shared with his daughter. With a grunt, he lifted the painfully heavy thing and situated it across his shoulders. It was heavy, very much so, easily as heavy as the ludicrous training sword he'd used with Guy, but it was not beyond him. He shuffled it for a moment, getting it settled along with his own swords, and saluted to the waiting Kazekage, who snorted and took to the trees. By the end of the day, Naruto was tired. Those who knew Naruto would understand that this was a rarity. He might flag, he might lose a little steam, he might even slow down for a moment or two. But rarely would they ever see the boy in such a state, where the first thing he did when the Kazekage called for camp was plop down bonelessly on the branch he had just landed and hang his head. It had been 8 hours, and there had been no stops. Even to urinate, he had to stop, then hurry to catch up. Food was nothing more than a survival ration eaten on the move, and Naruto felt a little amusement when he realized he'd eaten the packaging without noticing. Temari walked up and snatched the fan from Naruto's back. "Good job, Uzumaki," she said, sneering at him. "Now, I like to travel in style. I am a princess, after all." She tapped her odd, puffy hair to ensure it was in place. "I'll have you pitch my tent, Uzumaki." Naruto looked up at her, incredulous, but when he saw her unpleasant smile, he stood without comment and set to work. Her tent was normal equipment, a simple and cheap survival tent like any other. It took mere minutes for him to set it up, and he was happy to notice that he was no slower at it than Kankuro or the Kazekage at it, in spite of his tired state. In short order, they had a circle of 4 tents around a small fire. He sat in front of the fire, grateful to finally stop. "We still need food, Uzumaki," Temari said, her voice far too cheerful. "You know this area better than we do. Go find something." Naruto didn't even bother to sigh as he got up and set off into the forest. Survival hunting was something he was usually good at, but tired as he was, he missed his mark twice, allowing his targets to escape. He managed to catch a rabbit after a half hour, gutted it, cleaned it, and brought it back to a now dark and quiet camp. Temari was sitting on a nearby rock, and hopped down when she saw Naruto returning. "We got tired of waiting and ate already. You have first watch. Wake me for the second in 2 hours. No fires." She gave him another smirk and sauntered off to her tent while Naruto glared silently at her. He sat on the same rock, made a hand sign, and summoned 4 clones, who saluted and made their own hand signs before fading from view to take up overwatch. He then yawned and made his way to the remains of the campfire. He pulled out a kunai and bent over the shallow pit, then stopped. He had been planning on burying the rabbit under the coals, which would eventually cook it for him, but someone had carefully removed all of the coals and even the ash. He looked at the rabbit wistfully before creating another clone to carry it away from camp and dispose of it. He then settled onto the rock and kept watch. It was an act of will to keep his eyes open, but one thought kept him focused, playing again and again in his mind. "I'll be damned if I'll let her win." The 2 hours passed slowly, painfully so, and Naruto gave it an extra few minutes to ensure he didn't wake her early. When he was certain of the time, he walked over to her tent and quietly stomped his feet a few times, letting the vibration wake her. She opened her eyes and smiled at Naruto. He smiled back, uncertain. "Take my turn at watch, Uzumaki," she whispered, rolling away from him and burrowing under her covers. "Wake Kankuro in 2 hours." Naruto vowed, then and there, to get revenge, the thought of which helped him remain awake for the next 2 hours. "Surprised to see you awake," Kankuro said quietly when he climbed out of his tent. "Surprised you don't tell me to take your turn at watch," Naruto said, doing his best to keep his voice neutral. Judging from the look on Kankuro's face, his effort was wasted, because the other boy was grinning like crazy. The Suna genin sat on a rock next to Naruto's perch and laughed lightly before he settled into silence, unwrapping his puppet without a sound and sending it up into the trees as a surprise for would-be ambushers. He then leaned back comfortably and started watching his surroundings. After a minute, Naruto sighed, and without taking his eyes from the stars above he asked, "Is this sort of thing normal in Suna?" "What, the hazing?" Naruto nodded. Kankuro gave a quiet chuckle. "Kinda," he said with a shrug. "New genin are usually given some sort of test to make sure they are fit for service. I can't say it's usually this personal, but yeah. When a fight is on, and people might die, it's good to know how hard you can push someone." He looked carefully at the sleeping group, then leaned in towards Naruto. "It's also good to know how good they are at their job. It's as much a test of cunning as it is a test of strength. Remember the written part of the exam?" Naruto looked fully at Kankuro, and a smile slowly appeared on his face, before it fell. "Why are you telling me this? Won't I fail if you tell me?" Kankuro shrugged. "Did you get an order forbidding you from getting information from me?" Naruto shook his head. "Did you get an order explicitly telling you not to use any jutsu?" Naruto shook his head again. "No, but it was implied." His voice trailed off, then he rolled his eyes. "Second exam rules. Right. Do what you want, just don't get caught." After a moment of thought, he got up and stretched his aching joints. "I'm off to rest, then." He headed for his simple bedroll, then turned back. "Hey. Thanks." Kankuro smiled and waved the thanks away, and Naruto curled up into his bedroll and thought. Temari had to repress a smirk as Naruto stumbled under the weight of the fan he was carrying the first time they jumped onto a tree branch. She was fairly certain she knew what her father was up to with his orders, and even if she was wrong, it was amusing to watch a little kid try to carry an adult-sized training weight. She watched out of the corner of her eye as the kid stopped to readjust the weight on his back, then her jump carried her out of view. "Poor bugger won't ever catch up carrying that thing," she thought with a smile. "I should know." Baki had ordered the creation of that particular training tool, and Temari had grown achingly familiar with its weight since she had been disqualified from the exams. It felt odd, no longer having to carry the thing, but also delightful. She could feel the speed difference in her movements, and her appreciation for the tool was that much greater. There was a swishing sound, and she swore loudly when the little orange miscreant suddenly rocketed past her with a quiet snicker. Distracted, her foot slipped as she landed, sending her sliding off of the branch and plummeting towards the ground. She reached out, desperately grabbing at passing branches, but only managed to turn her controlled descent into a wild tumble. she stabilized herself enough to look down at the quickly approaching ground. Well, shit. She raised her arms to protect her head and neck, clenching her eyes and jaw, then struck with a surprisingly gentle impact. She thought nothing of it until Kankuro started laughing, and opened her eyes to find herself being held off the ground by the kid, who was posing dramatically. "Don't worry, princess, I got you," the boy said with a smirk. It was no help that he had apparently caught her and was now carrying her bridal style. It was really no help that Kankuro was cracking up, and even Baki was trying not to smile. Temari gave Naruto a shove and tumbled gracelessly to the ground, then stood up quickly and glared. Naruto shrugged easily in return, and loudly said, "I guess not carrying all this weight has thrown your balance off, princess. I am certain you are not usually this clumsy." Temari grunted and lashed out with her hand, snatching for her training fan, but Naruto ducked under her arm and jumped away with another laugh, taking off after the Kazekage, who had not stopped his progress and was well out of view already. "Keep up if you can, princess," he called out as he vanished into the trees. The second day ended as they reached the edge of Konohagakure's great forest. From atop one of the final trees, Naruto could see where the scrubland petered out into the full desert sand. Naruto let loose a sigh of relief, because this marked the halfway point between Suna and Konoha, and his second day was tiring, although also a great deal less miserable for it. After he'd caught Temari in the most dramatic and obnoxious manner he could devise on the spot, the rest of the day had been spent both traveling and keeping away from the girl. The look on her face had been priceless, especially as the day wore on and she became less angry and more amused. He had dodged every thrown pinecone, avoided surprise traps when she pulled ahead, and managed to land on his feet with every sudden gust of wind she sent his way. He looked down from the tree to see the other three setting up their tents. There was no demands for him to serve them, but he'd willingly gone out to find a fresh rabbit, and it was already cooking over the fire. Naruto stepped around the trunk of the tree, putting himself out of view, then held out the fan he'd been carrying. The moment he felt the thing lighten, he let go, and it vanished. A moment later, with a light clunk, the real fan dropped into view. He slung the much heavier hunk of metal across his back and started making his way down the tree, only to find the Kazekage waiting for him. "So," the older man said without preamble, "how did you do it?" Naruto smiled. "I carried it. After the first day, I got used to the weight and the pace, and it was much easier." Raza nodded, then reached out and poked at the fan. "You know, lying to your Kage is a crime in my village. It may not be in yours, who knows? But if you will serve under me, you'd best reconsider your answer." His voice and face betrayed no emotion, both flat and slightly disinterested, as if he were discussing the weather. Still, Naruto got the feeling the man was not angry, only curious. He's a serious and intelligent person. How would Kakashi handle this? Straightforward, just the facts, and sound as much like a good little soldier as possible. He drew himself up slightly, standing at attention, and dropped his smile. "Sir, the first time I fell behind with the excuse of adjusting the weight, but the moment the group was out of view, I summoned 5 shadow clones. 4 turned invisible and took the real fan, so they could take shifts carrying it and thus move at full speed. The 5th hinged into a copy of the fan for me to carry." Raza frowned. "You let my daughter's weapon out of your sight?" "No, sir. I left the training tool out of sight. I doubt she would willingly give her primary weapon to me, even if she did trust me, which is not a given. Further, it greatly resembles a training tool I myself used before, so I knew it for what it was. The fact that carrying my own weight instead of the weight of the fan was less tiring was quite telling." Raza nodded. "And now? How many of these clones are currently here with us?" "None, sir. I know better than to surround a Kage with invisible shadow clones, and they are under standing orders to avoid you except for emergencies. I currently have 8 around the camp as additional sentries, although I will have to replace them soon, assuming you choose not to order them away." Raza smiled, and while the smile was cold, it was also genuine as far as Naruto could tell. "You seem a great deal more formal than most Konoha shinobi I have dealt with, Uzumaki. And yet I get the feeling that is hardly normal for you, is it?" Naruto fought the urge to smile back. "I understand your village is different than my own, and apparently more formal about their duties. I may not be a true Sunagakure shinobi, but I can at least try to fit in." Raza nodded and turned back to the camp. "You did well, Uzumaki. My daughter was tasked with trying to provoke you, and you acted acceptably despite her efforts. A little loud on the second day, but we're as safe as traveling shinobi can get, so that is forgivable. I know you slept very little since we left. I will take the first watch, and will order the others to leave you alone for the night. Get some rest, genin. Even though Raza could not see him, Naruto bowed all the same. Thank you, Kazekage-sama. As was the nature of tired people everywhere, Naruto had trouble falling asleep at first. He was still awake when the Kazekage took sentry position and the others fell asleep. He was still awake when the Kazekage woke his daughter for her shift. She got up without complaint, grabbed her fan, which Naruto was gratified to see was being stored in a scroll in her pocket, and started pacing the camp. After a few minutes, she walked up, crouched down next to him, and quietly said, "Sorry about the whole piss off the Konohagakure genin thing." Nothing personal. Naruto grinned. Not worried about it. Princess. He wasn't certain, but her snort sounded a bit like laughter, which was good enough for him to relax and drift off into sleep. Naruto learned 3 important things about the desert over the next few days. First, the desert is hot. If he tried to tell one of his friends this fact, he knew they would roll their eyes at him, but the word hot did not do justice to the sensation of walking through the desert during the day, the searing heat so overwhelming it felt like a solid weight on his back and made every breath ache. No amount of water could fight that heat, nor shade. Even the Kazekage stopped moving when noon approached, and the entire group took shelter in whatever shade could be found. Second, the desert is cold. He suspected Sakura would probably roll her eyes at this as well, but it might surprise a few others. When the sun fell, the temperature plummeted, until Naruto could see his breath during the depths of the night. The Kazekage refused to light a fire, explaining that in the open desert even a small flame would be a beacon that could be seen for miles. Naruto found himself shivering each night, which did little to help him rest. Finally, and most importantly in his mind, the desert is made of sand, and it got everywhere. This would certainly surprise his friends, who he suspected would think the same thing he had, that walking atop the sand as if it were water would be enough. Naruto quickly discovered that sand was incredibly good at blowing into the folds of his clothing, the lining of his sandals, and every nook and cranny he had. The end result was a thin layer of grit that ground into Naruto's skin with every move until his flesh was raw and weeping. The worst part of the experience was the relative indifference of his traveling companions to these vital facts. The heat did not faze them. The cold did not faze them. And where he was reduced to limping gingerly by the end of each day, they strode untouched by the scouring sand. You get used to dealing with it, Kankuro said during the second night in the desert as Naruto gingerly lowered himself to the ground. The heat sucks, but as long as you keep going, it'll cool down eventually. The cold sucks, but it'll warm up sometime soon. Sand. He laughed and gave Naruto a grin. Sand always sucks. Nothing to do about that but endure and wait it out. We have a few things to help you adjust when we get to the city, ointments and the like that will keep you going until your body gets used to it, but for now, think happy thoughts about getting cleaned up tomorrow. Temari snorted in passing, carrying her unsealed tent poles in her arms. Kankuro spends more time primping than I do. Rest assured, if he can adapt to this, you can too, smartass. Naruto almost snapped at her, but he noticed her smile was a great deal less angry than before, and decided to take it as a joke. He lay on his back with another grunt and stared at the clear, star-filled sky for a moment. Hey, he said quietly after a moment, tell me something. Kankuro nodded as he dug into his pack for some field rations. Do you guys talk to Gaara like this? Kankuro froze, then turned woodenly to look at his sister, who was frowning while still holding up the tent pole she had been slotting into place. After a long and silent second she sighed and slammed the pole into place with a loud clack. No, she said, her voice cold. The reply we get from Gaara when we try to talk to him is usually along the lines of how he'll kill us if we don't shut up. He's not big on chatting, you may have noticed. Naruto nodded to himself. Give it a try, when you see him next. Temari was silent for a few more seconds before grunting and grabbing another pole, of course. We always try. The entrance to Sunagakure was a literal cleft in a wall of earth more than 50 feet thick, with several tiers of ledges for guards to stand watch and repel any theoretical attackers. Naruto had never seen such a forbidding fortress, and was more than willing to admit to himself that he'd reconsider any invasion attempt he might imagine after seeing the wall. He stopped short of the entrance to glare at the man waiting just inside the cleft, waving at him with a cheerful look on what little of his face was visible. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice a mixture of surprise and aggravation. Momochi Zabuza shrugged his massive shoulders, even under the weight of his blade, and looked at Naruto with a mixture of feral delight and fury. I've been hired by the village of Konohagakure to train one of its wayward genin while they live in this cruel land. He raised a finger theatrically, tapping the side of his head in an expression of thought, drawing attention to the Sunagakure forehead protector he now wore. What is it that asshole sensei of yours would say? Oh, yes. Hello, my cute little genin. 43, a price paid today from yesterday's bill. A/N, a short trigger warning. The below has someone being tortured. Not in a gore-heavy way, but genuinely tortured. Be so forewarned. The three of you are not being promoted to Chunin. Sakura, Sasuke, and Shikamaru shared a look, but it was Sakura who decided to ask the question. She took a step forward and bowed politely. We understand, Hokage-sama. But why have you gathered us here to tell us? Hiruzen smiled at the question. Because, I wanted you to understand why. He lit his pipe with a minuscule fire jutsu and took a deep drag of it before continuing. Each of you was under serious consideration, before the finals broke down in the attack. Without a vote from the visiting leaders, nobody will receive a promotion this year. I want to acknowledge your efforts and skills, even if circumstances prevent me from promoting you. Haruno Sakura, he said, smiling slightly as her face grew slightly pink under his attention. Your grasp of rules and how to break them, literally in the case of your preliminary match and metaphorically in your finals match, are astounding. In the first fight, you redefined the rules to a system that predates our village. In the second, you bent the battlefield to your will, and then bent the mind of your opponent to force them onto your battlefield. You should be proud. Uchiha Sasuke, he said, causing the boy to straighten and adopt one of his many serious faces, this one a look of blank disinterest that fooled nobody. While you may not be as innovative as your teammate, your tactics in the last round against Gaara were sound, and accounted for the strengths and weaknesses of your allies. That fact that you did not win against a literal monster of legend is nothing to be ashamed of, never mind disqualify you. Further, you showed a degree of concern for your allies that is exactly what is needed in a leader. You did not push to keep your short-ranged allies out of reach, but worked to minimize their risk in spite of the short range. You should be proud. He looked to Shikamaru, who raised his hands and backed up slightly. I lost, Hokage-sama, he said, waving his hands. I lost to Naruto, too. I'll admit he's changed a lot, but he's hardly a genius. Hiruzen nodded. This is true, Nara Shikamaru, but what you showed was more important than winning or losing. You accepted Naruto's challenge as an alternative to a straight battle, which would pit you against possibly the worst opponent you could face. In a contest that required you to solve a problem in which you did not even know what that problem was, you proceeded carefully and logically. Each time new information came to light, you adjusted immediately and appropriately. In the end, you lost not because of some terrible failing, but to the success of your foe. You should dash. Be proud, he finished for the Hokage, before he sighed and lowered his head. Don't tell my mother that. She'll never let it rest. Hiruzen let out a chuckle. Yoshino Nara was belligerent by any standards, never mind the standards of the Nara clan, which tended towards quiet contemplation that was heavy on the quiet. He had long gotten used to Asuma's tales of threatening the Nara boy with no worse punishment than "I'll tell your mother," and getting results. We could have used them as Chunin. The Hokage stood and turned to face the window, taking a few puffs of his pipe. There is a system in place to promote promising genin outside of the confines of the exam, and it's not all that uncommon for genin like yourselves to advance. Do you know why you are not being promoted? He asked. When nobody spoke, he turned, his face was hard and cold. Shinobi of Chunin rank and above are noted as such in their records, and also, inevitably, in the bingo books of the other nations, with as much detail within them so that if they come across you in battle, they may be able to get some vital information and survive. And within that information will be a mark which indicates that you advanced outside of the exam system. It marks you as special and dangerous. Such Chunin tend to be killed as a priority whenever possible. Such a mark may as well be a death mark. He shook his head slightly, and his cold glare became a more fatherly smile. You are far too valuable for that. Now, in a time without war, with no pressing need, I have no intention of marking the leaders of tomorrow for death today. Officially, you will remain genin until you pass the exam. Unofficially, expect to get more C-rank missions in the future, if not better. You are capable of such missions. Hiruzen gave them each a shallow bow and smiled when they each returned his bow with a deeper one, even the lazy Nara. Thank you for your service, Genin. You are dismissed. Sakura, Sasuke, could you ask your sensei to report to me? I have something I need to discuss with him. Sakura and Sasuke found Kakashi eventually, although it took them almost an hour. In the end, Sakura had summoned the horde and sent them throughout the town, on the prowl for the gray-haired shinobi, and any catnip and food they could beg or steal from its owners, as Sakura found out later. They found him standing in front of the memorial stone, and he was not alone. He was leaning over, speaking quietly to Gaara and pointing out something carved on the monument to the honored dead while the Anbu weasel observed. Sasuke and Sakura waited patiently, just within eyesight, and after a few more minutes, Kakashi gave Gaara a pat on the shoulder and walked over to meet them. What's with him? Asked Sasuke as his teacher approached. Kakashi shrugged and leaned in, speaking quietly. Just pointing out a few things. Showing how our fallen allies prove their existence, well beyond the point at which they passed. Weasel had suggested the boy could use a little perspective from those who survived the deaths of those they cared for. They all paused to look back at Gaara, who seemed to be staring at the stone with a confused expression on his face. Sakura was first to look away. Sensei, the Hokage wants to see you, said he had something to discuss with you. Kakashi's one visible eyebrow rose, and his voice took on a sing-song tone. Oh, and how did my little students do on the exam? Am I finally off the hook with your kids? Sasuke rolled his eyes and smirked. Says we would be Chunin, but you set such a bad example for us that we need to reform you. On the plus side, we're probably mostly done with D-rank missions at least. Kakashi chuckled and waved at them as he walked away. Maybe we can take a few for the fun of it. Kakashi stepped into the Hokage's office and stopped. The office of the Hokage had large windows that took in the view of the village below it. It was an inspiring vista to look upon, and Kakashi knew the Hokage loved the sight. But the shades were pulled now, the room dark and foreboding. Kakashi looked around carefully, and could not sense anyone within the room but the Hokage, not even his usual Anbu guards. The Hokage himself was sitting with his back to the door, facing the shuttered windows, and the room was thick with the smell of his pipe. After a moment, the Hokage turned slightly, then grunted and waved at Kakashi to close the door. What's wrong, Hokage-sama? Kakashi asked, the moment the door was closed. This meeting is to be without decorum, Kakashi. Kakashi blinked at that. It was expected of shinobi to follow certain codes of conduct and respect to their leader. A meeting without decorum was a meeting between two people acting as though they were equals instead of a leader and a subordinate. Kakashi knew of the rule because he usually used it when he was in command of a group, but he could not remember any Kage apply it to themselves. He walked in, and after a short pause, took a seat without being granted permission and waited. Hiruzen turned his chair and gave Kakashi a smile. I have called upon you, Kakashi, because I need to gauge someone's reaction to a few ideas I've had recently. Normally, I would ask Jiraiya, but he is busy digging into Otogekure, and this may be nothing worth recalling him over. I do need to ask that you keep what we talk about here to yourself, however. Kakashi nodded. What if I asked you, said Hiruzen, who should replace me as Hokage? Who would you think to give the duty to? Jiraiya, Kakashi said without even a moment of thought. Hiruzen nodded. And if he said no? This required a moment, but a short one. Tsunade. Hiruzen nodded again. And then, Kakashi had to really consider his options then. A short mental rundown of the current elite of Konohagakure tossed up a few prospects, namely Guy, Asuma, and himself. Out of the three options, one would assume Sarutobi Asuma would be the natural choice, but the man never seemed to work well with his father, and would not likely accept the hat out of stubborn resistance if nothing else. Mato Guy would be an excellent leader, but his reputation as a meathead, deserved or not, would work against him. And Kakashi himself spent a great deal of effort looking like a lazy pervert, which would make him less than ideal. Yuhi Kurenai was inexperienced with leadership and not well known. Mitarashi Anko had a bad reputation. Marino Ibiki was a little too cold for the way Konohagakure ran things, or at least his public face was. And Nara Shikaku would reject the proposal out of hand. After a moment, he shrugged. I know it would be Guy, Asuma, or myself, but none of those options are for the best. What is this about, Hawk? Hiruzen leaned forward and stared into Kakashi's one visible eye. And what if I suggested Shimura Danzo? That made Kakashi's mind freeze up for a moment. Danzo had the warmth of a dead animal and the personality of a rabid one. Whereas Hiruzen had always pursued peace through negotiations, Danzo preferred to earn peace with the blade of a kunai. He believed that an enemy who feared you was an enemy that would never stand against you, and his opinions on various political events throughout the years clearly reflected that. He was quite outspoken, in his own quiet and insufferably polite way, against everything that Hiruzen and the other Hokages before him had built Konohagakure on. Kakashi looked around the room again, then leaned forward as well. I really dislike saying this, but you said no decorum. I would suspect you were senile, an imposter, or mad. Hiruzen slumped back against his chair and sighed. I would agree with you, until the Chunin exam. Since then, I am slowly considering that option. Does that strike you as unusual, Kakashi? Kakashi nodded. Myself as well. I've opposed him almost my entire life, and until the exam, I would have sooner passed the title to Konohamaru before Danzo. And yet I almost did so today. He looked at Kakashi and flashed a feral grin. But whatever it is that caused this confusion, it broke once you mentioned how out of place it would be. Someone has manipulated me, Kakashi. I accepted Orochimaru's help without question in the fight against Gaara and his beast, without even considering other options. I almost pushed the Kazekage into giving Gaara to him, and were it not for Naruto's odd plan, that might very well have happened. And now, I have found myself considering turning over the job of Hokage to the man least suited for it. Hiruzen straightened in his chair, and in his eyes Kakashi could see the fire that drove the man. With your students now proven capable in my eyes, I intend to take you from them. I need someone with good sense to watch my actions, in case it happens again. He smiled coldly and started to repack his pipe. I also want to use you as bait. I intend to start grooming you to be the Hokage, both as a backup plan in case I pass suddenly, and as a lure for whoever has done this. We're not assuming it was Danzo, then? Hiruzen shook his head. Danzo would know better. I am certain he has been building influence behind the scenes to ensure he gets the hat after me, but he also knows that my sudden death by violence during a peaceful time would make any plan volatile to the point of foolishness. Even if he gained the position, it would be tainted by the mystery of my death. If an assassin appeared at a council meeting tomorrow, I'd be willing to bet he'd kill them himself to keep his plans running smoothly. Kakashi sat back in the darkness, letting his mind absorb everything he had been told. Hiruzen waited with him, lighting his pipe and smoking it furiously. You know, Kakashi said after a full minute had passed, I'm fairly certain I'm not ready to be a Kage, even as a backup option. In truth, I could have done without this. Hiruzen laughed. If you think this is bad, let me tell you how I got elected to my station. Danzo sat at his desk, his private desk, and fumed quietly. Hiruzen had announced his intentions to groom Hatake Kakashi as the fifth Hokage. Political allies by the score, now freed from the uncertainty of having no other option, were leaving his cause in droves and lining up to be acknowledged by the new rising star of Konohagakure. A man so dedicated to the foolish ideal of peace that he nearly died to Momochi Zabuza's blade out of the same foolish ideal of peace that Hiruzen suffered. And all because Danzo had given in to his impatience. That. And some bad advice. He looked up at one of his tools. Tell Sai to get a message to the man in the grass. Tell him that I no longer have need of him, or his failed plots. Sasuke stepped out of the Aburame clan holdings with conflicting feelings. On the one hand, his own training was going well. Between Shino and Shibi, he was making great progress on his hive and techniques, made that much easier by his hive's growth, which he had been pushing for the last few weeks. He would spend the mornings with the two Aburame, then join Sakura for a meal and to check in for missions. But they weren't team missions. Sasuke would never admit it out loud, and neither would Sakura, but they both missed Naruto immensely. It had been less than a month since he and Gaara swapped villages, and the lack of loud orange ramen freaks left things a little lackluster. The lack of Kakashi was also noticeable. They got partnered with whoever the Hokage chose when they got missions above D rank, but Sasuke found himself missing the comforting certainty of Kakashi. He knew how Kakashi thought, and while he had yet to see an incompetent Jonin team leader, or even Genin teammate, it wasn't the same, and Sasuke found himself thinking of Team 7 as the good old days. Seeing his teacher smirking at the two of them every day when he handed them their mission did nothing to help. He quickly arrived at their designated meeting place. Ichiraku's ramen was still going strong, in spite of losing its best customer. Tochi had discovered that business remained steady, mostly because those who knew Naruto had become customers almost out of habit. It helped that he had a few special menus printed with basic, non-ramen meals available to long-term customers, with the requirement that they never mention the menus to anyone else. Sakura was waiting at Ichiraku's, but she was already carrying 2 small boxes. "Just got a message," she said as Sasuke approached. "We've got a mission to pick up." They both started walking, ready to get to work, but something made him look around. There was something slightly off, something he could not consciously identify but that screamed of danger. He looked back, checking their trail, but saw nothing. "Sasuke?" He turned, already deciding to clue her in, and froze when he came face to face with someone who was not his teammate. Face to face with him. His brother. Itachi. He didn't need to think, to plan. He didn't waste time asking questions or pleading for answers. He didn't even draw one of his various tools and tricks. One quick kunai, drawn and thrown, as fast as the blink of an eye. Sasuke smiled. Itachi smiled back. The blade sunk into Itachi's stomach, folding the man over awkwardly. He stumbled back and fell, his face still smiling in spite of the blood flowing freely from his gut, and landed in a heap on the ground. Sasuke charged forward, a second blade in hand, and plunged it deep into the man's chest before he could try to escape, and still he smiled. Why would he smile? "Good job, brother," said Itachi, standing behind Sasuke, his hands clasped behind his back. Sasuke whirled, bloody kunai ready, and stopped when he saw Itachi nod to the body on the ground. Every instinct in him screamed not to look away, and yet his eyes were drawn to the body, an irresistible desire to see the truth pulling his eyes away from his hated brother and to the form of his teammate, Sakura, writhing on the ground in pain, her breath coming out in desperate, shallow coughs. Sasuke dropped his knife and knelt next to her, trying to hold back the crimson flow of life pouring out of her, but no amount of pressure or desperation could keep a ruined heart from failing. She reached out and pressed her hand against his cheek, still smiling in spite of the pain, then fell back and laid still, her eyes open and staring at him lifelessly. "Such a waste," said Itachi, his voice as bland as ever. "She might have made for a good brood horse for the clan after you were dead." Sasuke stood and threw a set of kunai, his mind set firmly on killing Itachi. There was no more holding back. The Hokage could step between them and he would kill the man to get to his cursed brother. His family was dead. His friend was dead. What else could be taken, that was worth more than those things? The kunai kept flashing out from his hands, tracking Itachi's every move. He only stopped when Kakashi slammed into his side, driving him to the ground with nothing more than his greater weight and strength. The gray-haired Jonin grabbed a fistful of Sasuke's shit and lifted him from the ground, only to slam him back down, driving the air from his lungs from the impact. "Stop, Sasuke, stop! You're killing people!" Sasuke stopped struggling, and only then did he hear the panicked cries, the alarms, the screams and moans. He turned his head and saw a woman, leaning over and clutching her stomach while a medical shinobi rushed to her. He saw a man screaming and clutching his face, blood dripping from his fingers and the handle of the kunai embedded in him. He saw the little boy, his eyes open in horror, his toy shueiken still in his hand even as he lost his battle to survive the deep slash across his throat. Itachi! Itachi was here! Find him! He tried to rise, only to be pressed firmly to the ground by his teacher. Other shinobi arrived. The medics ran to those who were injured. The ANBU ran and surrounded him. One leaned in and said clearly, "Sir, no enemy has been reported." Those who survived claimed to have seen nobody resembling Uchiha Itachi, nor any other suspicious activity before the event. Kakashi looked down at Sasuke, and something died within him, a spark of spirit that Sasuke had never noticed until it was suddenly missing from his teacher's one eye. "Take him to headquarters," the man said, quietly, emotionlessly. "I'll get Ibiki." Sasuke took a step, then stopped, confused. Kakashi had been holding him down, calling for tea and I. Sakura was dead, but Sakura was waiting at Ichiraku's, already carrying 2 small boxes. "Just got a message," she said as Sasuke approached. "We've got a mission to pick up." Sasuke whirled in place, already reaching for a weapon, then froze as he realized what was happening. He sighed and stood, abandoning his defensive stance. "It's an illusion. I'm not going to bother fighting you in here, Itachi." He turned back and was unsurprised to see Itachi holding Sakura up, a kunai to her neck. The man nodded once. "Yes, this is an illusion, little brother. And it will be an illusion for some time, possibly. But tell me. You know how the Sharingan works. I must see you, you must see me. Which means I am here, now, in the village, looking at you as you stride your easygoing way to the young woman you seem to value. At some point, the illusion will end. He slowly drew the kunai across Sakura's neck while she struggled, crying quietly as her blood flowed over her captor's hand. Are you so sure the illusion isn't over already? Itachi, emotionless as always, slowly drove the blade into Kakashi's heart. The man struggled feebly, his broken limbs reaching hopelessly for the weapon sliding into his chest, before he became a lifeless corpse. Sasuke struggled to rise and defend his mentor, only to slump to the ground, his broken body betraying him. Are you so sure the illusion isn't over already? Sasuke stood over the body of the Sandaime Hokage, his chest heaving, his hands bloody to the elbow. The old man had shown up when Sasuke attacked Itachi, but Itachi had captured Hiruzen in an illusion as well, and Sasuke had been forced to fight back or die. Itachi was leaning against a storefront, still pitiless, emotionless. Are you so sure the illusion isn't over already? Sasuke looked down at the blade in his gut, then looked up to see Sakura's eyes light up as the illusion over her faded. I thought. But. Tears began to flow down her face as Sasuke collapsed to the ground with a low moan. She reached for the weapon still buried in his body, then stopped when she realized removing it might be worse than leaving it. Get help! Sasuke managed to grunt out. Sakura stood, her lips trembling, then fled, crying, not towards the hospital or the Hokage's tower, but towards her own home. As soon as she did so, Itachi leaned over, looking down at Sasuke's face with bored detachment. Are you so sure the illusion isn't over already? Sasuke screamed and fell to the ground. Sakura reacted instantly, dropping the food and rushing to where he lay on the pavement. He flailed wildly, striking her several times in his panicked struggles, before he finally stopped moving. Sakura looked him over quickly. Sasuke seemed to be unharmed, except for his cursed seal. The 4 elongated tomo marks were spinning fast enough to make the seal look like a solid circle instead of 4 distinct marks, and as she watched, they slowed a slight amount, just noticeably. Sakura's first instinct was to call for help, but she held back and instead picked her teammate up and over her shoulders. She could call for help, but she wasn't that far from the hospital. It would be faster to get him there herself. She took off, jumping onto the wall and then to the roof, smashing the tiles in her haste. Below, the civilian crowd murmured and gossiped and grumbled, except for 2 of them. A slim, raven-haired woman and her large, bald bodyguard stood from where they had been eating a light lunch and started to walk away. Hope you got what you needed, Itachi, Kisame grunted quietly, his henge smiling hugely. I'd hate to think all this effort was pointless, and without even a single good fight. The woman nodded in return. I hope so too, Itachi replied without inflection. 44. From suffering comes wisdom. Sakura sat in a chair outside of the critical care section and fought against the urge to cry. She had delivered Sasuke to the hospital, where it took only a moment for the medic on duty to rush him off to the chakra illness ward. Nobody forbade her from entering, but nobody permitted it either, and Sakura knew well enough that getting in the way of a healer at the wrong time could cause disaster. Since she had arrived, she had seen Kakashi, the woman with the purple hair from the exams, and the Hokage himself enter the ward, as well as several others she was not familiar with. But they were experienced, and she was not. She waited. Nearly an hour later, a nurse stopped in her rounds to let Sakura know that she would be permitted to visit the next day, and encouraged her to go home. At a loss, feeling useless, she did so. She went home, had a very small meal, and then retired to a long and sleepless night. The first light of dawn found her waiting patiently in the visitor's room. The same nurse from the other day, now wearing a light jacket as she headed for the front door, actually turned around the moment she saw Sakura and clocked back in to take the girl to her friend. And yet, as early as she was not the first to see Sasuke that day. She jumped slightly, her hands heading for her kunai pouch, when she opened the door and saw the Anbu, Weasel, standing over Sasuke and watching him. The moment she arrived, he walked over to her and leaned in. We're not sure how he is right now. Something tried to influence his mind, and something else got in the way, possibly that seal on his neck. Be on guard, just in case. He gave her a friendly pat on the shoulder, then with a final glance at Sasuke, left. In hindsight, Sakura might have found it odd for an ANBU to be visiting in uniform. But that thought was brushed aside as she stepped over to the bedside and looked down on her teammate and friend. He was not resting well. His arms and legs had been strapped to the bed, and periodically he would thrash slightly in his restraints before growing calm. He gritted his teeth periodically, as if in some unbearable pain. Curious, Sakura carefully lifted his head to one side and looked at the seal on his neck. Each time he struggled, the seal would spin, eventually slowing to a stop when he ceased moving. She sat back, then jumped when someone laid a hand on her shoulder. She spun, instinctively lashing out at whoever had managed to sneak up on her, and then froze when the Hokage caught her fist. He did not look offended, and waved away her stammered apology to focus on the Uchiha. "Tell me, Sakura, what do you think is happening?" She took a moment to order her thoughts, then said, "I think the seal is hurting him, possibly mentally. Every time he pushes and fights, the seal starts to spin, and it stops when he does." The Hokage nodded to himself, then gently leaned over and turned Sasuke's head to show her the seal. "Watch closely," he said quietly, and together they stood quietly for a few minutes until Sasuke started to clench and strain again. Sakura frowned. The seal started spinning after Sasuke started to move. The Hokage nodded when he saw her narrow her eyes, and he let Sasuke's head slump back into place. "Yes," he said, stepping back slightly. "The seal, according to everyone I have gathered and questioned about it, seems to be helping Sasuke. There is a foreign chakra flowing through his system that regularly triggers an episode. Every time it does, the seal starts up and absorbs some of the chakra until the effect ends. Every time this happens, the overall amount of foreign chakra goes down. We expect it to be gone sometime tonight." Sakura listened to his explanation with more and more confusion, until she finally blurted out, "But why is it doing that?" "That's the seal Orochimaru put on him, the one he attacked Ino to apply." "Why would it be so helpful?" "I do not know," the Hokage replied, shaking his head. "There is little my former student does that makes sense to me anymore. He leaves here in disgrace for doing terrible deeds, comes back as the leader of a hidden village and is polite. Even friendly, at times. And I cannot imagine why he would do so. He gives Sasuke a seal that makes the boy better at resisting. Well, he must have noticed the look on Sakura's face, because he took a moment to give her a smile. What matters for now, Sakura, is that Sasuke is slowly recovering from an attack that can leave permanent mental impairment, in a way that clearly indicates he will likely be fine. For now, let us focus on that. Just keep an eye on him, both for damage and for danger. You understand?" Sakura nodded, a grimace on her face. Sasuke had just suffered a mental attack that could make him dangerously unbalanced, and then started healing with the help of an unknown seal. He could come out of this dangerous to himself, to others, even her, and as much as it hurt to admit it, she knew her duty. The Hokage nodded again, his own face grim, but he managed a small smile. "You've been cleared to stand by for his awakening. In many cases, victims of such effects need a calming and trusted influence when they come to." He gave one final glance at Sasuke, then turned and opened the door. "Good night, Sakura." He didn't wait for her to reply, which suited her fine as she turned back to her fallen friend and watched him silently. The first sign Sakura had that Sasuke had awoken was the sensation of cold steel pressed to her throat from where she sat, her upper torso resting on the bed where she had fallen asleep. Her eyes snapped open and immediately took in the empty bed, and she could feel the slight difference in the weight of her equipment pouch to explain the presence of a weapon. She clamped down on her instinct to struggle and instead did her best to remain calm. She could hear his breathing, ragged and fast, and the weapon trembled slightly against her throat. "Easy, Sasuke. Easy. It's okay. It's me." A rough hand grabbed her hair and pressed down on her head slightly, restraining her. "That's what you always say. Then Itachi will detonate the tag, or stab through you to get to me, or control you to try to kill me. Either way, it always ends the same. I'd never kill you, Sasuke. You never had the chance," he replied coldly. She felt the blade press slightly harder against her neck and acted. Her hand shot out and grabbed the kunai by the blade, hand clamping firmly in place. Sasuke pressed harder, and her fingers began to bleed, but without momentum, he was not strong enough to cut through against the strength of her chakra-enhanced grip. "Sasuke, you need to stop," she said coldly. "I won't let you kill me, or anyone else, regardless what you went through. And if you do manage to kill me, Kiri already knows to hunt you down before you hurt anyone else." She began to push the blade away from her neck, and was surprised to find no resistance to her efforts. She stood and whirled away, looking at her teammate in the meager light of the moon through the curtain. He was standing still, having already backed a few steps away, and while the blade was still in his hand, he held it to his side as if forgotten. "Sakura, who is Kiri?" His voice trembled as he spoke. She held her hands away from her body, palms up, not daring to move. "She's my cat, and my primary summon. I actually asked her not to be here to make sure she didn't overreact if this happened." He dropped the knife and staggered over to the hospital bed, sitting on the edge with his back to her. "I want to believe you're real. The illusions of you never had Kiri with her, and never really fought back. I can't believe you would not fight back. Not even against me. Especially me." Sakura slowly approached, and when Sasuke didn't react, she reached out and laid an arm across his shoulders, which caused him to flinch. She leaned against him slightly, then noticed something that made her wonder if she was in an illusion now. Sasuke was crying. He didn't sob or gasp for air. In truth, he was eerily silent. But there was no mistake when the tears began to fall down his cheeks. He slumped even further, his head bowed down in exhaustion. "He killed you," he said quietly, little more than a whisper filtered through his tears. "He killed you, and Kakashi, every civilian on the street, every shinobi that tried to help, the Hokage, the council, everyone. He killed you all, right in front of me, over and over again. Everyone was powerless against him. Even me. Especially me." He took a deep shuddering breath, a gasp for air. "He had me kill everyone. It was an accident, but that didn't make you any less dead. I'd stab him in the neck, and watch Kakashi struggle to hold back the blood. I stabbed him in the gut, then held you and watched you die a slow and painful death, forgiving me with your very last breath." Then the tears stopped, and Sasuke lifted his head to look at Sakura, his Sharingan activated. With his bright crimson eyes standing out in the dark, his visage became more than a little terrifying, all the more so when she noticed that his eyes now had 3 tomo each, fully activated for the first time. And each time, he asked me the same question. Over and over again. "Are you so sure the illusion isn't over already?" he'd ask. Every time I failed to save someone. Every time I killed the wrong person. Every time. "How long were you in there?" she asked. 68 hours. I know a little of what he's done. I made sure to count down, once I caught on. Worst case, I've got 4 more hours to go. Sakura nodded and quietly got up. After a quick search, she sat down next to him again, leaned over, and placed a small clock on the bedstand. "We'll wait 5 hours, just to be sure." Hiruzen opened the door to the hospital room quietly to find the 2 genin sleeping, still leaning against each other. He smiled to himself and started to close the door. "Hokage-sama," said Sasuke quietly. Hiruzen opened the door a bit and looked at the young man. "When I am released," Sasuke said, keeping his body perfectly still, even his head still slumped to one side, "I wish to speak to you about something." "What about?" Sasuke smirked, perfectly aware of what might sound like a return to form. "Training," he said quietly, before he shut his eyes again. Within moments, he began to breathe deeply, in meditation or in sleep. Hiruzen smiled and shut the door quietly. Sasuke shut his eyes for a moment, breathing slowly, and then opened them again to glance at the clock. "I remember hitting the 5-hour mark clearly," he thought to himself. Sakura kept me awake. Told stories. Gossip. Bad jokes. Whatever it took. He didn't want to admit it, but her presence had been tolerable, and even pleasant. He still had no interest in the chattering gossip she still partook upon, and little in the way of a sense of humor, but she knew that, and adapted to it. Her gossip was less about who was dating whom, and more about what weird training Lee was doing nowadays, or how Ino was shaping up in her taijutsu, or whatever Tenten did that wrecked half of Training Ground 9 in a hellish explosion that left bits of iron embedded in the ground for 400 feet. Her jokes were less about punchlines, and more about Kakashi getting punched, which was often deserved as well as amusing. The stories, those had been about her, and her family, and her old friends, and other drivel that Sasuke cared nothing about but still found himself listening to anyhow. He didn't feel angry at wasting his time listening to her talk, nor did he feel resentful that she had family where he did not. Just hearing her talk about the drab realities of her life was a comfort. Dead teammates don't tell stories. Breathing quietly as he started to drift back into sleep, his mind drifted back to the textbook Kakashi had given him on genetics. The genes for green eyes were recessive to the genes for black eyes. It took several days before Sasuke was deemed fit to leave the hospital, but within a half hour of being discharged, he and Sakura were standing before the Hokage and Kakashi. Both stood strong, almost defiant in their body language, and while the Hokage had an impressive poker face, Kakashi looked aggrieved, at the very least. "Say that again," said Kakashi. "It's time to disband Team 7, said Sakura. Hiruzen leaned forward. "Explain," he said, his face still emotionless. "We're down a man," said Sasuke, frowning slightly. "Gaara has become more stable since he and Naruto switched, but he is nowhere near ready for active duty, I think. This means we're short-handed, and we'll either get a new genin assigned to us, or be relegated to D-rank missions until who knows when. Besides," said Sakura with a smirk, glancing at the Hokage, "we've been seeing an increase in assignments. You could probably use Kakashi as something more than a glorified babysitter. At least he would not be getting paid to read on the job." "Hey," said Kakashi, huffing theatrically as Hiruzen repressed a snort. "I'm right here, you know." Sakura nodded and shot Kakashi a nasty grin. "And in the last week, I've seen you ejected from Asuma's house, ejected forcefully from Anko's, locked up twice by TNI, and been kneed in the groin by Kurani in an admittedly beatific manner. You're bored, sensei, and breaking in another genin will drive you and us both into madness." She looked back to the Hokage, and her grin faded. "Besides, Sasuke and I both know what we need to do next." This got a look of surprise from Hiruzen, who glanced at Kakashi and noticed the man was just as surprised. So they didn't tell him this in advance. They must have spent Sasuke's time in the hospital discussing things. He focused on Sakura. "And what is that, Sakura?" Sakura seemed to slump slightly, closing her eyes and letting out a long breath, but when she opened them again, her stare was as hard as iron. "I intend to begin training for TNI, and would like to gain your blessing and recommendation." "Sakura," said Kakashi hesitantly, worry evident in his tone and face, "TNI means torture and interrogation. It is, not a gentle field of study on the body or the mind. I would not wish that duty to fall to myself, never mind my student." Sakura did not look offended, but instead gave Kakashi a warm smile. That warmth was somewhat ruined, however, by the fire in her eyes. "I understand and appreciate the warning, but someone will someday have to take on that duty, and I suspect I'll be better at it than most of the alternatives." Hiruzen considered her words carefully, keeping his face still as he did so. Of her age group, only Nara Shikamaru is smarter, and he is certainly more suited to code breaking and organization. Aburame Shino might manage to have the right aura of disinterest, but once the shock of immediacy wears off, most of his techniques and skills are unsuited to long-term interrogation. And while Yamanaka Ino might have her father's skill in mind jutsu, her nature does not seem fitting for the more vigorous duties in TNI. He sighed and nodded. "I will send word to Marino Ibiki and suggest your candidacy for TNI training. Passing the test he gives you will be your own concern." He ignored the angry glare Kakashi was aiming at him and turned to Sasuke. "And what do you intend to seek?" Sasuke stepped forward, then dropped to his knees and pressed his head to the floor. "Teach me, Hokage-sama." Hiruzen chuckled and told the boy to stand. "I'm not a young man," he said once Sasuke was facing him again. "I may not be able to teach you as much as you might think. Most of my techniques have been taught to others. They can teach you to fight as well as I could. You're still a strong warrior, and I would enjoy learning your skills, but that's not my only purpose," said Sasuke, his usual stern appearance firmly in place. "I want you to teach me to lead. Someday, I will have a clan, and I want to be prepared to avoid the pitfalls of my ancestors. Someday, I will likely have command over others, and I want to be prepared to guide them as well as I can. And someday, Kakashi will have to pass that hat." "To you?" asked Kakashi, his tone playful. "To someone else, I think." Sasuke let a fond grin spread across his face, and found it felt good. "And when he gets it, he'll need someone to help make sense of the mess you'll leave him." "What of your brother?" asked Hiruzen, watching closely, alert to any sudden change in manner, and surprised to find the boy almost unfazed by the question. "A leader cannot put himself first. It might well be that your brother might escape unpunished, if your duties prevent you from acting." "What then?" Sasuke's grin faded, but he did not become the surly boy Hiruzen expected. There was a hint of anger in his tone, but far less than Hiruzen had expected. Kakashi once asked me, why listen to your brother's advice, when he's nothing but a traitor? My brother's message has always been the same. Get strong. Get revenge. Over and over again. But he tipped his hand this time. He wants me to kill him for some reason, but I'll be damned if I let him direct my life like that. If I get the chance, I'll gladly end his life, but I will not discard my own to find it, and I will not risk the deaths of others for something so small as vengeance. Hiruzen went quiet and looked at Kakashi, who was looking rather surprised, and a little pensive. He then stood and walked around his desk to stand before Sasuke, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. I will train you, he said quietly, looking at Sasuke sadly, if that is what you truly want. But before you make that decision, there is something you must know. He leaned in and whispered something in the boy's ear. After a moment, Sasuke leaned back, anger and disappointment warring on his face. Sakura could see something else in her friend's face as well, a sort of acceptance, like preparing to take a bitter but vital medicine. She placed her hand on Sasuke's other shoulder and got a pained smile from him before he took a deep breath and let it out. Hiruzen nodded carefully. That is the price you pay, to be a leader. You often carry burdens so others do not have to. Is that still what you want? Sasuke felt like he should be angry, but found that his once constant fury had deserted him. Even after Kakashi had pushed him away from his obsession, it simmered in the back of his mind, always present, counting down the seconds as Get worked and struggled and fought to get that much closer to that final confrontation. And now, my brother is not a traitor. I will want to know the full story, he finally said. Hiruzen nodded, and it was not lost to Sasuke that the old man looked as sad as he felt. 45, Shopping Trip. Suna needs resources. Naruto peered into the alleyway, carefully controlling his breathing. He couldn't see anything hiding back there in the early light of dawn, but that meant nothing. Seeing was no longer believing for the genin. In the month he had been in Sunigakure, he had learned a lot. He learned that his breathing was loud, his steps were loud, his heartbeat was loud, his blinking was loud. And each of these lessons had been learned on the end of Zabuza's fist. Naruto still wasn't sure about how he felt about his new teacher. The man was prone to sudden, immediate, and painful correction of any and all errors. During exercises, Naruto always knew when he lost, because his body would suddenly start accelerating in whichever direction Zabuza punted him. Anyone but Naruto would have suffered an extended stay in the hospital by the end of the first week. Naruto knew he could take the punishment, however, and Zabuza seemed to know it too. The former missing Nin was vigorous in punishment, but only when correction was needed. When Naruto got something right, Zabuza showed a surprising amount of respect, in his own rough way. Considering what Zabuza was teaching him, Naruto wasn't sure if that was a good thing. Orange. Orange. Naruto grinned and waved back at the kid who was shouting at him. Ayachi. How are ya, squirt? He asked with a shout. Ayachi grinned and ran up to Naruto. Like most of the kids Naruto had seen in the village, Ayachi was both familiar and strange. He was shorter than Naruto was used to for his age, with browner skin and dull brown hair, and he was dressed in simple earth-tone shirts and pants, with simple sandals. But for all the visual differences, the kid might as well be Konohamaru's long-lost sibling. He was loud, he was obnoxious, he was fun, and he was a friend. The child was also fascinated by Naruto, specifically his clothes. Naruto had noticed early on that bright colors and tones simply did not factor into the Suna lifestyle. Everything was dull, and usually brown. Because of this, his bright blonde hair and outrageous orange jumpsuit stood out like a sore thumb. Adults usually looked at him oddly, and those in the know often had some fear in their eyes, undoubtedly equating him with Gaara. But the children, they were spellbound by the strange, loud, bright stranger in their midst. Naruto opened his mouth to say something, but Ayachi's eyes twitched slightly upward, and even as he silently cursed, Naruto was in motion. He tucked and rolled forward, summoning a pair of clones as he did so. He ignored the sound of an attack passing over his head and came out of his tumble just as his first clone grabbed Ayachi and threw the boy down the street in a long, gentle arc. Naruto grabbed the second clone and tossed it even harder in a much more linear path. Comfortable that the second would catch the kid, Naruto finally dedicated himself to his surroundings, ducking another blow even as he turned to face his opponent. Already ducking, he had no chance to avoid the knee to the gut. He grunted, folding over Zabuza's leg, before vanishing in a puff of smoke. Zabuza watched as the first clone started to circle him, even as the now distant second clone caught the madly laughing local kid. He cracked his knuckles and sent his student a cold grin. Clone decoy, huh? Shouldn't you try something different, little shit? The clone smirked, but lost its smirk when Zabuza whirled and punched behind himself, knocking the real Naruto to the ground and dispelling his camouflage technique. Your breathing hitched right before the attack, little shit. Zabuza grinned in a manner one could call cheerful if you could ignore the sharpened teeth within it. Still, you're doing better than before. You used to dash. Zabuza sent his elbow down, thumping an invisible clone on the crown of its head and dispelling it. Okay, he admitted, I'll admit that one got a little closer, but dash. Zabuza had to stop talking at that point, because he was too busy smashing clones. Each one would appear briefly before poofing into non-existence, each one in the middle of an attack. He stepped side to side, casually dodging barely visible kunai, occasionally darting forward to smack another clone before returning to his place, still grinning maniacally. Eventually, the attacks slowed, then stopped. Naruto remained in the dirt, pinching his nose to stop the bleeding but watching the fight play out all the same. Each failed clone gave him another perspective, another experience where his stealth failed, and each one just added to his expertise. They weren't failures, they were learning experiences, and Zabuza understood this. After several seconds of stillness, Zabuza nodded to himself and turned to face his student. So, he said, how did you find me? Naruto smirked. You had sand pears for breakfast. So? I know full well my scent is largely gone. They give you gas, Zabuza-sensei. Naruto leaned into the honorific with a devilish grin. Zabuza growled, for although his anger had long cooled on the matter, the boy was being a pest. I hate when you call me that, little shit. I'm not your damned sensei. I'm just getting paid to teach you so someday you'll be a big shit instead. Exactly, sensei. Zabuza managed to keep his snarl for several seconds, but it broke when Naruto started to sniff at him. The scowl broke into a frown, which slowly turned into a sharp-toothed grin. Okay, yes, you got me with that one. How'd you really find me? Naruto stood and brushed himself off, rubbed out the little bit of blood still on his lip, and gave a big smile to his snarly teacher. I sent out some clones when I woke up for the daily exercise. One of them spotted how the civilians all seemed to be shying slightly away from the alleyway and dispelled to inform me. I assume it was a side effect of your killing intent. Zabuza nodded and crossed his arms, going into full lecture mode. Yes. Killing intent is presented as something you must push outward, almost as a technique, although it requires no skill and no chakra, but that's bullshit. It's not something you push out, it's something you pull in. All living things can detect your killing intent to some degree. Shinobi tend to grow accustomed to it through exposure, and eventually it fades into the background, an occasionally useful feeling that tells you you're being hunted. Same goes for predatory creatures. We both live in a world of kill or be killed, and only those strong enough to learn to resist the fear it triggers will survive. Civilians, like all prey, are far more sensitive to it. Even if they don't understand it, the little part in their brain that says something dangerous is close can be tripped by even the slightest amount. It's because of this that shinobi who excel at infiltration tend to have great control of their killing intent, or have little of it to begin with. That's why I never feared Haku, isn't it? Asked Naruto. Zabuza nodded, and for a brief moment, a genuine smile crossed his face. Yeah. Haku was never big on the messier parts of being a missing nin, but he was very good at working his way into towns and getting supplies. I have enough murder in me to cover us both, and it was nice to be able to eat real food on occasion. Zabuza's smile turned into a smirk. It's amazing what you can spot when you realize how killing intent works. Once I left Kirigakure and became a missing nin, I made my reputation by hunting down other missing nin and hardened killers. Walking into a town and spotting the target immediately because the civilians around them instinctively lean away is one of the finer things in life, seconded only by a quick, clean kill. Naruto looked troubled. Zabuza nodded to the kid, inviting him to speak. After a moment, the boy looked up and asked, did they deserve it? Deserve? Zabuza snorted, but his smirk faded. Hell of a question, little shit. Most of them, yeah, they deserved it, about as much as I did anyhow. We're killers by trade, Uzumaki, and any professional killer who can't hack it in their village is usually the worst of our kind. He looked down at the dirt beneath his feet for a moment, but when he looked up again, his smirk was back. Good thing you Konoha pussies couldn't kill me. Whatever, Zabuza-sensei. We had you dead to rights, and you damn well know it. Naruto chuckled, and was glad to hear the almost silent laugh he got in return. What had started as a serious disagreement had turned into a running gag between the two of them, Konoha's weakness against the fact that they still, in his own words, beat his ass like a drum. Zabuza seemed to get great amusement from his experience in Wave Country, and if he was going to give Naruto shit about it, Naruto was going to give it right back. The moment ended, and Zabuza waved a hand at Naruto. Technique practice is at sundown. Don't forget your girlfriend. She's not my girlfriend, shouted Naruto, trying and failing to cover the fading sound of Zabuza's parting jeer. Naruto scowled at the sand for a moment, then snorted and started working his way over to Iochi, who had watched the entire event at a distance with wide eyes. Sorry about that, kid, he said, rubbing the back of his neck. Was in the middle of a lesson when you found me. What's up? Whatever Iochi's original intention, it had long been swept away. Instead, all he could do was hop in place, arms outstretched, and shout, again. Again. Toss me again. Naruto's days were divided, much to his dismay. Life in Suna revolved around the desert and its habits. He woke before dawn for training in stealth, hunting, and evasion with Zabuza. Shortly after sunrise, Naruto reported in for D-rank missions, which were often done before noon. Anything not done by then, and not vital enough to need immediate attention, waited a few hours for the temperature to lower slightly at that point. And then, when the sun started to set, he and Temari would meet with Zabuza, who supervised the two of them as Temari tried to train Naruto in his element, having been promised more advanced techniques once Naruto caught up to her. Hey, Kankuro, princess, he said as he approached the round structure that the Kazekage used for business, immediately ducking a blow from Temari. Kankuro laughed. He always laughed, which was why Naruto got along with him so well. Many of the people in Suna seemed grim, and he could admit that life here was certainly less lavish than elsewhere. But he laughed at hardship, and so did Kankuro, and that laughter became a bridge between their different lives. We got anything good today? He asked, once Temari settled for glowering at him, albeit in a cheerful manner. Tsunagakure had learned very quickly that Temari and Naruto got along like a house on fire. They nettled and argued and one-upped each other, all in good fun. Admittedly, she tended to act almost like Sakura used to, giving him a good swat whenever he pushed too many buttons at once, and calling her princess was a big one, all the more so because her new nickname was beginning to get around Suna. Naruto considered himself lucky. The last Suna shinobi who called her that to her face lost 3 teeth. Actually, said Kankuro, grinning even more than usual, if we kept our spot in the rotation, we might have a good C rank waiting for us. Travel outside the village and everything. Try to not deserve to be swatted by my sister in front of the Kazekage, yeah? I'd ask you to look professional, but, yeah, said Naruto, swatting the puppet user lightly in the arm as they walked through the door. Not my fault your sister's psycho. Shush, said Temari, trying to ignore the jonin at the doors, who were either angry at them or desperately trying not to laugh at the show, to judge by their painfully still faces. Naruto gave her one more smirk before he forced his face to relax into the sort of bland disinterest that most of the Suna shinobi seemed to show when on official duty. They walked up a long spiral staircase that wound its way up to inside of the building around a big, open atrium. A shuttered skylight above let light into the atrium, and a single tree grew within it, a gift from Konohagakure from the end of the Third Shinobi War that was taking up much of the space of the atrium and leaving the floor below in shadow. Each floor of the building had a small balcony that wrapped around the atrium, allowing access to the rooms that ran all the way along the walls. After several floors, they entered the office of the Kazekage and lined up quietly before him. The man sat alone, in a small and unimpressive chair behind a large but unimpressive desk covered with scrolls. He looked up as they walked in, but his face did not change from its habitual scowl before his eyes dropped back to the paperwork he was writing. He reached over to one side, grabbed a scroll, and lightly tossed it to Temari, all without giving them a second glance or even taking pencil from paper. Escort north for trade. Baki will be busy elsewhere, so you're in charge, Kankuro. List on the scroll, money and travel papers at the gate. He looked up again, and for a moment, the scowl lifted just slightly, as close to a smile as the Kazekage tended to get while on duty. Don't spend all your savings. The 3 genin bowed and marched out the door in an orderly manner, which ended the moment they got out of the Kazekage's sight. Temari and Kankuro both cheered, much to Naruto's confusion. One of the Jonin door guards broke her usual stony silence with a laugh and asked, "Trade mission?" This got another grin and a nod from the two Suna genin. "So?" asked Naruto as they walked towards the main gate, a relatively narrow and well-guarded pass through the rock walls that surrounded Sunagakure. "What's with all the excitement?" "What's our mission?" Kankuro smirked. "It's the best C rank they offer here. It usually goes to a team that is fractured or under strength, otherwise, it goes on a rotation. We get to head north to the edge of the desert to trade for needed supplies, then come back." Naruto shrugged. In theory, they counted as under strength without Baki, but he suspected that his current team was considered both of those qualifiers mostly thanks to his status as a newcomer, in spite of their individual strength. He knew Temari was chafing a little at being stuck with D ranks for the last month, and even Kankuro was growing unamused at the tasks they had been getting. "So? You like to haggle or something?" Temari gave him a swat. "So, it means that we have access to a trade hub. You remember how you said there is no good ramen around here?" Naruto nodded, his face falling. He'd run out of ramen weeks ago, only to discover that the local shops did not sell any brands he considered worth purchase. Most of what he had found was tasteless and disgustingly salty. Ramen was apparently treated like field rations back home, emergency food to be eaten only where there was no choice and packed with nutrients that made it at best a bland meal. He often saw a busy shinobi eating it dry, straight from the packaging. It was horrifying. Temari grinned. "Well, now's your chance to stock up. 3 days out, 1 day to buy the goods on our list and seal them, 3 days back. Pack some sealing scrolls and all the money you want to spend on luxuries, because we won't get this mission again anytime soon." "How long will it be?" Naruto asked, already trying to determine how much he wanted to spend. Kankuro and Temari shared a look, and the puppeteer shrugged. "This is our first time on trade duty, mostly because of our brother's temperament." The siblings frowned, and Naruto thought he saw Temari's hand shake slightly as she suppressed a shudder. "But from what we've heard from others, it might be 6 months or more before we get another chance, assuming we're not out on another mission when it comes up." Naruto upped his planned expenditure, adding in some from his savings as well. He was suddenly very glad of the prize money for the photo of Kakashi's face. While he had few needs here in Suna, he had several wants, and that hefty payment might be his only means of getting any of them filled during his stay. While the pay for the D ranks he'd taken with his temporary team was about the same as back home, they were far less common, and many tasks that were needed by the village's infrastructure were done with severely reduced pay. Rent was cheap, mostly because few people here outright owned their property, instead renting directly from the Kazekage's office. Basic foods were also relatively cheap, being mostly provided by the low-paid D ranks. The same was true of shinobi goods. Local iron was mined by cheap shinobi labor, forged by slightly less cheap shinobi labor, and sold at no profit by retired or disabled shinobi who lived off a pension. Genin who were learning how to make storage seals and explosive tags on the slightly thick paper made from the greenhouses had their successful efforts being sold by those same shopkeepers. The barest needs of the shinobi of Sunagakure were met without any undue difficulty, but the moment you looked for an item that could not be made with Sunagakure labor and materials, prices skyrocketed, and that was if you could find those items at all. Naruto was surprised to find that a simple piece of candy could cost more than a good meal, especially if that candy was made from anything but honey, which could be collected from the beehives used for pollination in the greenhouses. "Hey," he said after a few moments, "why is it hard to find ramen and stuff here, anyhow? Like, why don't they just bring more stuff in?" Kankuro snorted. "Few reasons, Uzumaki." He held out his hand, index finger extended. "First, it's a long trip even by shinobi standards, never mind civilian traders. It takes us 3 to 5 days of running over the sand to get to the nearest trade hub, which means it might take civilians a month to drag a cart here through all that sand. Here and back, that's a couple months of work for one cart of sales, which is hardly worth the difficult trip." He raised a second finger. "Second, there is risk versus reward. Right now, Sunagakure has reached a point where we have little money to entice trade to come to our city. If you're a merchant, and you make the long trip through a dangerous desert, only to find out nobody can afford your fine silks or spices or whatever, you just lost a few months of time for no profit. Why bother, when you can make at least as much money selling elsewhere?" Temari grunted, her face sliding easily into a serious expression. Don't forget how dangerous the desert is for non-shinobi, Naruto. You were pretty roughed up by the time we arrived. Imagine if you were a civilian, spending months to get here and back. Sandstorms, heatstroke, frostbite, poisonous creatures, even some bandits on the edge of the sand. Nobody's going to deal with that for a village with little money to spare. The same things that makes our village a stronghold also makes it poorly suited to trade. Third, Kankuro continued, nodding along to his sister's comment, there is the lack of money in general. With business being so slow for the village, we simply don't have the money for much. We could send some genin more often, but they'd have no money to buy goods. He tucked his hands into his pockets and shrugged, gesturing with his elbow at an empty storefront, the windows obscured with dust and dirt. Ultimately, nothing changes because nothing can change. Can't get trade without money, can't encourage the local economy without trade, can't get more money into the system without more third-party missions, and we probably won't be getting an increase in those after this last exam. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. I know Dad's hoping to fix it before the next Kazekage takes office, but at this rate. Naruto stopped, looking into the empty storefront silently while the others kept moving on. Just visible through the filth, he could see countless bins and racks, and a counter with a small mechanical till, all covered with dust. A big chalkboard was behind the counter, still proudly proclaiming the quality and value of the products within, with a small message in the corner, hastily scrawled, that said, going out of business sale. Kankuro and Temari came to a stop a few steps later, then shared a glance and wandered back. Naruto was staring into the closed shop, his eyes narrow, and his lips were moving as if he was mumbling to himself. After almost a minute, Temari reached out and tapped Naruto on the shoulder, resisting the urge to flinch, as being spaced out and mumbling was often a bad sign with her younger sibling. Naruto turned, his eyes distant for a moment, before he focused on them and smiled. Sorry, he said, shaking his head. Just doing some math. 3 days of travel lead them to a large and bustling town that worked as the civilian section of the small shinobi village of Ishigekure. Ishigekure was nowhere near as powerful as even the smallest of the 5 great villages, but it was well known for training its shinobi not as assassins and warriors, but as guards and watchers, which they commonly sent out on escort missions with caravans and important people. It was a small niche in the shinobi world, but one that fit them well, and Ishi guards were considered to be level-headed and polite in addition to strong defenders. The town was obviously a trading hub for the village, with roads leading to the lands of earth and fire. When they had approached, Naruto had scuffed his feet in the dust, and in doing so found that there was once a rough roadway in the direction of the land of wind, although it had become disused over time. They had arrived at the town walls, a thick band of stone that had the smooth and uniform look of jutsu-produced stone. Their Kankuro, the nominal leader of the mission, checked in with the shinobi guarding the gates. The 2 men wore the mark of Ishigekure, and both looked at the 3 young shinobi with mild interest. The older of the 2 men, a short and somewhat squat man with a curved sword taller than he was strapped across his back, nodded at them when they approached. Trade from Sunigekure, I take it. Kankuro nodded and handed over one of the 2 scrolls he had picked up from the gate guards back in Suna. This scroll contained a copy of his orders, signed by the Kazekage, as well as a formal written request for permission to enter the town addressed to the captain of security for the town. The permission had long become meaningless courtesy, a routine so often used it stopped being necessary and became, well, routine. I take it you are Nagase no Odachi. The short man grinned and pointed at the sword over his back. What was the first hint? He asked with a chuckle. He then eyed the 3 of them. Don't recognize you. First supply run for you kids. When the genin nodded, Nagase's partner suddenly glared at them and stepped forward. He was a tall and thin man, his face hidden by a blue scarf and several braces of kunai going across his chest and waist. Rules, he said in a rough voice. No fighting. No jutsu. No espionage. When you enter, you're a civilian who just happens to be a shinobi. If there is a problem, talk to one of us, because if trouble happens, we tend to solve it on both ends, usually permanently. Understood? The team nodded, somewhat nervously, and Nagase's nudged his partner roughly in the ribs. None of that, Sato. We've never had a problem with the trade squads from Suna, no need to be your usual friendly self. He turned to the kids and smiled. Look, just don't get into any trouble. If a problem comes up, come talk to one of the guards before you start tossing jutsu, okay? He waved them off when they nodded, and the two guards went back to leaning against the wall. Nagase rubbed his jaw for a moment and then glanced at his partner as the genin walked into the town. Half wonder if these will be the ones who figure out that Shin's been screwing them in pricing. That short fellow in orange looks like the description of Konohagakura's Jinchuriki. The one from the last Chunin exam. And we both know who trained him. Sato grunted and rubbed his left arm. I half wonder. I still owe Kakashi one for that one time with the noble's daughter. Nagase rolled his eyes. You tried to stab the man when he was only there to deliver a message, Sato. How did you think he'd react to a genin trying to sneak attack him? Failed at the sneak part, I might add. Yes, all's fair in shinobi warfare. But did he really have to Kancho asterisk me in front of her entire family? Naruto found himself unimpressed by Shin's trade emporium. The shop was a mostly rundown warehouse. A small shack, installed in front of one of the big loading doors, held a few samples, a counter, a register, and Wakata Shin, a doughy older man whose dull eyes almost sparkled with greed the moment he saw the Sunagakure team arrive at his doorway. Ah, welcome. Always a pleasure to see to the needs of my good friends in the sand. He wasted no time, but immediately handed Kankuro a clipboard covered with paper, with a worn-down pencil attached to it with some dirty twine. Just mark on the sheets what you need, and I'll send a worker to gather it. Take your time, have a look at the samples. Here, have a treat on me. He handed each of the kids a small paper-wrapped cube from a small bowl on the counter, which Naruto realized with a moment's inspection contained a small chunk of chocolate. He sniffed at it discreetly, and when Shin turned away from him, he added it back to the bowl with just as much discretion. Temari glanced at him, saw his frown and exaggerated glance at the bowl, then dropped her candy on the floor, flicking it with her sandal to slide under the counter. Kankuro saw the exchange and palmed his own. Naruto nodded quickly to them, then said in a loud childish tone, "Gee, thanks for the candy, stranger. I always love unsolicited candy. Helps me think. We'll just go browse the samples and start marking down our order, then." Temari and Kankuro's faces froze while they resisted the urge to laugh at his acting, and once Shin stopped looking at Naruto with a confused expression, they followed him into a corner of the shop. "It's not just chocolate," said Naruto quietly, flipping through the clipboard and glancing at the listed prices and volumes. "There's alcohol in them, a lot of it. Smells a little musty too." Temari looked around at the corners and walls. "This whole place is musty," she mumbled, fingering a small bolt of cloth that looked soft and felt rough. "I think this place must be closed most of the time. There is a lot of dust ground into the samples." Kankuro nodded, holding up a tool from a toolbox and smiling as if pleased. "The whole place is poorly maintained. Rusty hinges on the doors, nails sticking out oddly. The place is a shithole. Not sure why the gate guards back home suggested this place." "Convenience pricing," said Naruto quietly, showing them the clipboard, where he had marked several items. "This is a wholesale warehouse, which usually means lower pricing for bulk purchases, but I know these items are from Konoha, and there is no way the price should be this high. They're charging more, possibly for the convenience of having it all housed in one place." Naruto looked up, and Kankuro stepped back slightly at the glare on the blonde's face. "And these gate guards back in Suna, do they always suggest this place?" Temari's eyes narrowed. "You think they're getting a kickback?" Naruto shrugged. Maybe they remember it from their genin days, and the place used to be better. Maybe they think it's funny, in which case your dad's going to be pissed when I tell him. Either way, we might be better off shopping around a bit. Think we can get the list filled elsewhere?" Kankuro asked, somewhat doubtfully. "We only have a day scheduled for this place." Naruto smirked as he turned to drop the clipboard off at the counter. "Who needs time when we have numbers?" "Excuse me, Nagase-san." Nagase blinked and looked away from the civilians he was watching to find the orange genin from the Suna trade party waiting patiently next to him. "Yes." Naruto stood to attention, his face formally blank. "As a visiting shinobi, I respect your rules and your boundaries. I am here to request permission to use a jutsu within your territory." "Oh? What for?" "I wish to use a clone jutsu to speed up the search for suitable vendors. We have a long list of things to get, and only a day to get them." Nagase crossed his arms. "And if I say no?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Naruto thought for a moment, then gave the guard a cheeky grin. Then I'll have to try and outsmart the watchers I'm sure you already have on me. No offense. Nagase glared at the boy for several moments, before he started to grin back. I'd expect nothing less from any kid, never mind a shinobi. Go ahead, but not henge, so you'll be easier to keep an eye on, okay? And if you are who I think you are, no going invisible either. Nagase. Sato stood up, his hands rising to the bandolier on his chest. That's a shinobi, and possibly an enemy. Nagase rolled his eyes and shooed the genin away. Oh, come off it, Sato. If Konoha or Suna wanted to stomp us flat, would they really need whatever information a bunch of genin could provide? Pride is all well and good, but not when it makes you blind to reality. Let's see what the little guy is going to do. Naruto scurried over to his two teammates. Right, how many items on the list, he said, taking the scroll from Kankuro's unresisting hands. About 50, he said. Temari said nothing, at a loss for words. He asked permission. They gave permission. Naruto nodded, and quickly made 100 clones, drawing a surprise gulp from Sato and a smirk from Nagase. Alright, guys, you all got a copy. Half of you, find the items, check in when you have to get the money from Kankuro. The left side of the crowd shouted in agreement. Other half, you guys are to look into pricing in general, make note of other possible goods, and find me some damn ramen. The right side of the crowd shouted louder, and a few cheered. I'm going to go find somewhere to eat, and then the three of us are going to the market to meet up. Hey, wait. He turned to Nagase. Are there any really big, obvious landmarks in the market area? Nagase shrugged. Got a fountain. A fountain. Singular. Can't miss it, thanks. He turned back to the waiting crowd, ignoring the odd looks he was starting to get from civilians passing by. You heard the man, I'll be at the fountain in an hour or so. Get to it. He ignored the cheers and shouts as his clones started to scatter and turned to Kankuro and Temari, who were looking at him oddly. So, he said with an obviously false air of casual conversation, I'm thinking ramen for lunch. You? It was at the ramen stand, on his fourth bowl, that Naruto noticed he was being watched. It was a young man, only a few years older and a foot taller than Kankuro, who was sitting in another booth across the room, the privacy curtain drawn back so he could stare at the genin trio. The man was thin but well-muscled, which was obvious, as he wore only a pair of red pants. He slid his hand through slicked-back gray hair when he saw Naruto look his way, and he smirked when Naruto started to turn away again. He stood and stomped over to stand in front of the trio, crossing his arms and leaning down to tower over them. Naruto, Kankuro, and Temari looked into his dull purple eyes and saw nothing but trouble. Do you have a moment to talk about the glory of Jashin? Haiden asked with a manic grin. Nagase was questioning a civilian merchant about their cart, those questions mostly involving the obvious false bottom and the hidden goods within it, when he heard the shouts. He stood and glanced at the smoke cloud coming from near the market district, then sighed and drew his odachi as Sato pointed at him and laughed. Shut up, he said to his partner as they began to run. 46, Heathens. Jashin demands worship. Catch-up blurb. After agreeing to switch places with Gaara to give the Suna Jinchuriki a chance to learn to be human after his rampage in the Chunin exams, Naruto found himself serving as a genin in Suna alongside Kankuro and Temari. They got a simple trade mission to a trading town outside of Ishigekure, a small independent hidden village. It was during a quick meal in the town that an odd religious man with the mouth of a sailor approached them. Naruto set down his latest bowl and looked at their uninvited guest, feeling somewhat bewildered. So, wait, Jashin wants you to indiscriminately murder people? Haiden shook his head. He was sitting next to the blonde, slowly eating a bowl of various meats he'd convinced the server to bring him. Not indiscriminate, he insisted loudly, mumbling around a mouthful of food. He paused to swallow, then glared at Naruto. Not indiscriminate. Jashin is content to take random scrubs as they come to him. But to face a powerful opponent in combat, and to slay them in the name of Almighty Jashin, is a glorious and righteous thing. Kankuro and Temari shared an incredulous look, their food long forgotten. This Haiden person had approached them and immediately launched into a debate with Naruto about his odd deity. He seemed to be dead set on convincing Naruto to join his cult, outright ignoring the other two in favor of his loud and often uncomfortable discussion. The fact that Naruto was taking the whole thing in stride wasn't helping. Between bowls, he had been chatting with the cultist with an almost friendly air. The staff at the restaurant was starting to give them odd looks, possibly from when Haydn had commented about not wasting time on them. So, Naruto mumbled around a mouthful of noodles, "Why aren't you trying to, kill us then?" "Not that I'm objecting." Haydn grinned at the kid. "That's kinda why I am here, kid." He set his bowl and chopsticks down. The high servant of Jashin teaches us that life is nothing but a furnace, our body a crucible, with no greater purpose than to burn away the impurities of our souls and prepare us for death and service to Lord Jashin. Suffering is there to help burn away weakness. But then, one day, I asked the high servant what purpose joy had. He said that joy was an impurity that made even the strongest of humanity weak and unworthy, and that my only thought should be dedicated to my service to most worthy Jashin. I bowed and apologized and took my punishment as befitting one of Jashin's flock, and went on with my life. Then one day, I walked into the high servant's quarters to give him a message. Haydn snorted, then started laughing, a raucous guffaw that only increased when he pounded on the table for emphasis. The old man was sitting in his chair, quaffing sake and having far too much fun with a fellow member of flock. He saw me, and he had the nerve to tell me that the pleasures of the flesh are a terrible temptation for lesser men, and I should never follow his path until I reached the highest of levels in the order. Fucking hypocrite. Temari glanced at her brother quickly, and saw his subtle hand signal, indicating he was ready to use his puppet as a distraction for escape. "So, what, you ran off?" Haydn rolled his eyes and grinned at her. "Do I look like a pussy?" "I didn't run." His eyes took on a sinister shine, a small glow that spoke of the most profane of pleasures. "I fucking killed him. I drew my blade and attacked. He pulled the girl up to shield him. That fucking scumbag," holding up a fellow follower of Jashin as if the idea of her death might stay my blade. Her last words as I ran my blade through her was to curse him for his unworthy ways. He didn't get any last words, 'cause I ripped his lungs apart with the first blow, but I think he was trying to beg me for his life. But I'm not so good at lip reading, any more than I am normal reading, so I could be wrong. But I doubt it. Fucking coward. He slapped the table for emphasis once more, causing the food bowls to jump. Naruto swallowed the bile rising up the back of his throat and tried to ignore the look of joy on this strange man's face. "So, what's the problem then?" He was worthless in the eyes of Jashin, so why care? Haydn smiled. "I knew it was a good idea to talk to you, kid. You were creative enough back at the gate, so I thought you might be able to help me out. You see, the other priests, they were upset. They told me that I killed a servant of Jashin Almighty, and thus was unworthy of service unto him. But..." He looked down at his bowl of meat, and when he looked up, he looked sorrowful. "I felt something I never felt before when I sliced up that old man. Sure, I'd killed a few dozen people before in the service of Jashin, and it felt okay, properly done, but never particularly worthy. How worthy can a civilian banker or retired genin be? But when I cut apart that lying, decrepit old heretic, I felt more than okay. I felt righteous. As if Jashin himself took pleasure in my dutiful slaughter." He sighed, and his head slumped slightly. "Then the assholes chucked me off the mountain. Surprised you left after they kicked you out," said Kankuro, smiling as if speaking to murderous zealots was a normal thing for him. Haydn looked at Kankuro, confused, then shook his head and waved his hands. "Nah, not like, kicked me out so I had to leave. They threw me off the holy mountain as punishment. Literally. You know, heave-ho and off they go sorta thing. Tried to kill me without even letting me die in battle, like some fucking nobody." He crossed his arms and glared at his food. "Now I don't know what to do. What to believe. Before it was simple. The high priest pointed, and the flock acted. Now there is no high priest to guide me, no flock to support me. I'm alone, and I don't know if I should mourn the loss of my place at Jashin's feet, or if he's trying to teach me a lesson." His dour mood ended suddenly, his frown replaced with a sharp grin, and he slipped an arm around Naruto's shoulders in a friendly grasp. "But now I found you. You seem sorta smart, which is good, but you also seem crafty, which is better. I'm sure that with enough discussion, we can sort this out, no problem, and then when you see the glory of Jashin for yourself, I'm certain you'll join me in my praise." Naruto flinched and tried to sink lower in his seat, only to find himself held in place by Haydn's arm. His first thought was to tell Haydn not to kill anyone, but one look into the man's eyes clearly indicated how useful that would be. His second thought was to try to suggest some sort of clearly defined rules to determine who should die, but, who the hell am I to decide that sort of thing, he thought to himself. Naruto was not inclined to kill anyone who wasn't an immediate threat to him and his, and even that was an unpleasant prospect. Whatever he told the stranger, it might well send him off into the world to slaughter any number of people. It was at that moment that a man walked into the restaurant. Dressed in a grey robe, his hood pulled up to bathe his face in deep shadow, he calmly walked over to the table and bowed deeply to them. "What do you want?" Haydn asked, sneering at the figure. "Glory," the figure replied, before pulling back its robe to reveal the dozens of explosive tags pasted to his bare chest. The tags all hissed as one, and the world dissolved into light and noise. Naruto pulled himself out of the wreckage with a groan and slumped to the ground. A moment later, Haydn pulled himself out as well and leaned over to inspect Naruto. Through the ringing in his ears, he thought he heard the man ask if he was okay, but it took several moments for the question to register, because as his vision cleared, he saw that Haydn was completely unmarked. Not so much as a blister marred the man's skin, despite the rather severe burns Naruto could feel in various places, throbbing in agony. Where's the other two? Haydn only looked at him and shook his head, saying something he couldn't make out. Naruto was on his feet in an instant, ignoring his own screams as the torn shreds of his clothing rubbed across raw and weeping flesh. He scrambled over the broken wood and smashed cookery, until he got to the place he could best remember they had been sitting. He started digging at the rubble, his burned hands leaving bloody handprints on everything he touched. Eventually, the rubble stirred, then heaved, revealing Kankuro's puppet hunched over the two Suna siblings. Kankuro was holding one of his arms against his chest, and Temari had several shards of pottery embedded in her legs, but both were largely untouched by the blast. They crawled out of the rubble and started to speak, only to stop when they saw Naruto. "What the hell happened to you?" asked Temari, shock displayed openly on her face. "I'll be fine," he said in return, waving his hand only to fall face down on the ground. The back side of his body was covered in debris made of wooden splinters, broken bowls, and even several whole chopsticks. What wasn't embedded into his flesh was stuck to him because of the coating of blood the other injuries provided. Under that, they could clearly see that much of his skin had been burned away horribly. "Shit, cover me!" Temari shouted, scrambling over to him and starting to examine the fallen boy. His heart was still beating, regular if not strong, and his breath was even. He was wounded, but he didn't seem to be dying, something she attributed to the demon sealed within him. She turned to check on Kankuro, then froze. 3 figures were standing in the street, on the very edge of the blast radius. Each was covered in a grey robe, with hoods and black lacquered masks concealing their faces. The figures were roughly the same shape and size, making them appear to be the result of some sort of clone technique, but the one in the middle was armed differently. While the 2 flanking men carried only a short serrated blade each, the one in the middle held a straight staff as tall as he was, with 3 parallel scythe blades at the end. "Haydn," said the middle figure, his voice deep and menacing. "Zidane," said Haydn with a bored sneer. "That's High Priest Zidane now, heathen." Haydn snorted. "Funny. They promoted the weakest of us all to leadership." He looked around, then walked a few feet to his left and bent down. With a grunt, he ripped out a 3-foot plank of wood, broken to a point on one end, and hefted it over his shoulder. "And you should talk. You say I'm a heathen, but you're the one that claims I should have denied Jashin his due. The whole lot of you are heathens, and no matter what else I might be confused about, I am certain that Jashin would see you weaklings destroyed." With a sudden burst of speed, Haydn charged. Zidane barely had time to twitch his fingers before the wooden board was lodged into his guts. He spat blood on Haydn's face and smiled down at him. "You were blessed with Jashin's strength," he said as he reached down and slowly pulled the wooden spike out of his body, slowly sliding Haydn back with his effort. "But I have been blessed with his very presence." Zidane lashed out, striking Haydn in the face and sending him tumbling. Haydn twisted as he rolled, and turned the uncontrolled tumble to a graceful landing. Even as he looked at his foe, the man was there, scythe blade descending. Then a powerful gust of wind struck Zidane, throwing the man back into the wall of the nearest building. Temari stepped up to stand with Haydn, fan out, and glared at the 2 standing men. "You're fucking nuts, but not to blow up the entire restaurant for no reason, nuts. I'm going to beat the hell out of your crazy cultist friends." Haydn laughed. "Thanks, you fucking heathen, but it's pointless. I'm immortal." And so am I, snarled Zidane as he pulled himself out of the impression he'd made on the wall. He stood tall, his rope dropping open, to reveal his chest and stomach, already healed from his earlier impalement. He smiled coldly at Haydn. We have business to attend. Somit, Sekit, remove the heathen, if you would be so kind. Temari brought her fan around just in time to block a quick thrust from the thin blade, only for the other cultist to lash out with a vicious kick. It struck her fan with such force that she found herself tumbling down the road. She got up and set herself, only to hear Haydn shout, "Get your friends, girl. They might be trash, but they're strong trash." His shout suddenly ended when Zidane managed a lucky blow, slashing Haydn's throat even as Haydn smashed him in the skull with a rock. Temari glanced at the two men moving towards her, and with a scowl, she swept her fan into the air, sailing for the edge of the town where she had seen Kankuro carrying Naruto. "Come on, kid, now would be a good time to get up. I was beginning to think you had forgotten me, little creature." Naruto sighed and pulled himself up from the water that flowed in the sewer outside the broken gate in his mind. "As if I could forget you, asshole." He stepped past the gate and entered the bright white void. The Kyuubi was as he had been when they first met, its pose one of contemplation. The only change Naruto could see was that it now supported itself by two tails, one chained, the other free. Naruto walked forward until he was at the base of the tail and sat, his legs crossed in imitation of the beast. "You lied to me. You told me Shikaku was master of manipulation. You lied." The Kyuubi leaned forward, his body tilting and bending, until its head finally arrived to look at Naruto's back, upside down. "I told you what you needed to know to win." When told to face their fears, no creature is truthful to itself. Some creatures cower, some creatures thrust their chest out with false bravado, but no creature simply faces them. Had I told you the truth, are you certain you would not have blurted out your fear to my brethren? Would your companions have died to give Shikaku the pleasure of your suffering, rather than toying with you until his own foolishness ended in his restraint? The Kyuubi snorted, spinning Naruto until they were face to face. "Can you truly say that I did you harm?" Naruto crossed his arms and grunted, scooting his legs until his back was to the beast's face. After some time in silence, however, the boy sighed and turned around, to find the beast unmoved from its previous position. "I guess you have a point," he grumbled. The Kyuubi's body flexed and it straightened out, then its great arms and legs unfolded and it stepped onto the ground. It turned until it could lay its head down to look at Naruto with one yellow eye. "Remember this lesson well, little creature. Often, what people need to hear is not what they desire to hear. You will do this yourself someday, should you become leader of your fellow creatures as you so often proclaimed in your youth." Naruto nodded, then blew out a sigh. "Sorry." One titanic eyebrow rose. "Why are you sorry? I know you've been trying to get my attention. I ignored you. So, yeah, sorry." The great head rotated until both eyes were focused on Naruto. An eternity passed, in which both beings refused to look away, before Naruto shot the giant fox a grin. It snorted hard enough to push the blonde back a few inches, but it did not present itself in a menacing manner. "Strange human customs aside, I assume your presence here means you almost died." "No, maybe, okay, yes. I think a bunch of stuff got punctured when all those bits of building got in me. Anyhow, if that's gonna happen, I could use a little help being not dead." The Kyuubi rolled its great eyes and began to rise from where it had been lying. "Please." It stopped for a moment, then nodded once. "I shall heal you, and stand by in case you need further help." Naruto stood, and after a moment's thought, bowed to the creature. "Wow, that must have hurt, little creature. I don't think you've ever used those muscles before in all your tiny little life." "Love you too, asshole," Naruto said with a cheeky grin. The beast snorted loudly, blowing Naruto back out into the sewer of his mind. Naruto's eyes snapped open, then glanced down at the hand across his mouth. "Sorry," whispered Kankuro, taking his hand away. "Didn't know if you were a screamer." "Bite me," whispered Naruto in return, glancing around as he did so. They appeared to be inside a basement, one filled with boxes piled haphazardly. A single trapdoor lead out of the room, and from his place behind some of the boxes, he thought he could just make out the form of Karasu, Kankuro's primary puppet, slumped in a corner as if discarded. "Any idea what we're fighting?" Kankuro shook his head. "Sis and I figured you're too useful to let you sleep it off, so she had me take off and try to get you back up." "How you feeling?" Naruto snorted and reached back to brush some of the glass shards and wooden splinters from his shoulder. Wonderful. You ready to fight? As he asked this, his eyes darted towards the entrance, and Kankuro nodded once quietly. When the figure dropped through the trapdoor, it barely touched the floor before his puppet Karasu had wrapped its arms around them. Anything the figure might have said was lost as Naruto darted in and slammed a Rasengan into its chest with enough force to blow it back out the way it came in. Naruto followed it a moment later, leaping up into the building they had been hiding in and then out into the street, then stopped when he saw where his target had landed. Little white slivers had been scattered across the road, all pointing towards the tattered figure on the ground. Then it shook and rose into a slouched sitting position. A single tattered hand rose and pulled back its hood, revealing the empty eyes of a skull, its manic grin made more frightful by how its lower jaw had been split by the attack, leaving its mouth to hang open like a snake. It suddenly lunged, propelled by an unknown force, its legs dragging on the ground. The broken jaw swung wide, letting loose a mournful howl, and its arms opened wide to embrace Naruto like an old friend. Its fingers dug into Naruto's clothes, clenching with unholy strength, then leaned into the blonde's ear and whispered a single word, "Goodbye." The explosion shook the walls of the surrounding buildings. Every window on the street shattered as the shock wave passed, and when the dust cleared, a 3-foot crater had been blown into the road itself. Across the street from where Naruto had been hidden, Somit stepped onto the roof, ceremonial dagger held tight. He hissed as he observed the ground below, then went quiet as Karasu's arm smashed through the roof below his feet and grabbed his leg. He spun in place, ignoring the poisoned blade that slashed at him to stomp down viciously at Karasu's torso. Wood snapped and crunched, and Karasu dropped back into the building before running out the front of the home to join its owner, guarding Kankuro as he stepped out of the now shattered doorway. "A puppet user," said Somit, his voice rough and cold. "How quaint. As if your wooden simulacra can stand against the power of death." He spread his arms out, and from behind, 2 more figures rose in the air to flank him. With taut, dry skin and empty eye sockets, it was clear that the 2 figures were once living people. It took a few moments before Kankuro remembered the old word for his foe's techniques, but once he did, he grinned. "A necromancer," he said, then snorted. "How quaint. You think your toys can stand against the risen dead, heathen?" "No," Kankuro replied, spreading his hands and making Karasu step forward. "Your minions are clearly unmodified. You grab a couple bodies, parade them around, and act as if it's impressive. A couple inefficient corpses opposed by the pinnacle of engineering that Karasu represents? I don't think my toys can stand against yours, I think mine will crush them." Somit crossed his arms, his head bowed. "Wood is a limited resource. The dead are nearly infinite." As he spoke, more and more figures rose from behind him, then began to spread from around the house, then came from down the street. Kankuro jumped to the roof of the house he was standing before, only to find that the building was slowly being surrounded by silent bodies. "Destroy all you can," said Somit, pointing at Kankuro with his dagger. "You'll join them soon enough. Kill him." Temari darted behind a garbage can and exhaled as quietly as she could. One of her pursuers had abandoned the chase quickly, but the other continued to hound her. Their fight had quickly taken on a pattern. Temari would hide and wait. When her pursuer drew close, she would attack, lashing out with a wide-angle sweep of her fan before hiding once more. The person after her was quite skilled, managing to avoid most of the damage, but he had been struck several times, and the last time they clashed, he had barely stumbled out of the way, leaving a trail of blood in his wake. She heard a scuff from the alley across the way, and in a single move she rose and lashed out, sending a wall of wind blades into the alley. There was a muffled shout and a splash of blood as the robed figure was covered in slices. It dropped to the ground with a thud and lay unmoving, the alley beneath him slowly turning red. Temari took a single step forward, then stopped and smirked. She lashed out with her fan, sending another wall of wind out to hit the motionless body. The wind cut deep, scattering the blood around the alleyway and cutting the body into small manageable chunks. She waited quietly for a full minute before she started to relax. She turned, already preparing to find her brother and Naruto, then stopped as something caught her foot. She looked down and had a moment to notice the thin red band around her ankle before she was violently pulled to the ground. The pulling sensation increased, and she slid across the alley, the rocks and the dirt grinding at her skin. She was pulled aloft, and found herself dangling by one leg looking as some strange creature. It was vaguely human-shaped, but its limbs were long and thin, grossly disproportionate to its torso and head. It was bright red, and its skin writhed and pulsed slightly even when unmoving. It lowered her slightly until its face nearly touched hers and opened a dripping mouth to laugh at her with a gurgling, choking sound. Temari realized that the monster was not bloody, but entirely made of the stuff. "You damaged my shell badly," Sekit said, one distorted hand reaching up to grab hold of her fan. "'Tis a fine fan you carry, heathen," it gurgled, pulling the fan away with irresistible force and dropping it on the ground. "But it will do you no good. The blood is the life, girl, and now I'll take yours for myself." The second hand drew back, the fingers collecting and melting into a ragged spear, but the monster stopped and glared at Temari. "I can feel the beat of your heart. It's so even. You can't mean to tell me you're not scared." Temari crossed her arms and glared at the bloody thing. "No. My own brother is scarier than you. Besides, I know something you don't know." She formed her hands into the snake seal and glanced at the ground, where her fan lay at its feet. The reaction was immediate. Sekit howled and tossed her in one direction while its legs extended and flowed, pushing it up onto the building beside it, where it ducked for cover. A moment later, a bloody head peeked over to glare at Temari, but she was gone. Sekit chuckled as its body started to drip and pool on the roof before finding a convenient crack to slip into. "Game on, heathen," it gurgled cheerfully before it vanished from sight. Naruto darted from building to building, careful to avoid the clattering skeletons as he did so. As much as he wanted to help Kankuro, the plan they had come up with made sense. The moment the skeletons thinned out enough that he could move freely, Naruto searched the rooftops until he found a series of close buildings with large flat spaces on top. Enough space for a massive shadow clone army. "A section," he said as the first group appeared. "Find the team, Haiden, and every Ishi shinobi you can and give them an update. Go in pairs so one can dispel to update me too." They saluted and ran off. "B section," he said to the second, much larger group, "you're on civilian duty. Find any civilians and warn them. Try to direct them to safe areas, preferably outside the town or into the presence of Ishi shinobi." They dropped to the side of the buildings and began running through town. "C section, stay here. Your reserves, act as you see fit. D section." He looked at the fourth group, who all had feral grins on their faces. Giving orders to his clones helped reduce possible mistakes, but in the end, all of the clones knew what he knew, and these ones knew what they were about to be told. Graveyard duty. Clear the streets. Nagase and Sato were moving across the town's rooftops when they spotted three skeletal figures trying to claw their way into a house. Even as they crouched down to launch an ambush, however, a half-dozen orange clones suddenly faded into view, 3 of them with Rasengan already formed. They hit each of the skeletal figures, blasting their bodies into pieces that scattered around the doorway. "Nagase! Sato!" A 7th clone landed on the roof above the doorway and waved. "What the hell did you do?" shouted Sato, his hands raising to rest atop his bandoliers. Naruto threw up his hands. "I didn't do anything. Some assholes randomly attacked another shinobi, and my team and I got involved when they decided to kill us." He paused for a second, staring into space, then looked around. "The one with the skeletons are in the western residential sector, fighting Kankuro. You gotta blow those things apart, break their skulls, or they just pop back up. Haiden and their leader are fighting in the commercial district, looks like they're just smashing each other to see who stops regenerating first. No sign of Temari or the third guy, but there is a lot of blood in the northeast residential district, looks like someone's been dragging a body." He dropped to the ground and saluted. "How can I assist you best in stopping this?" Nagase and Sato shared a glance. "I'll get the skeleton guy," said Saito. "It sounds like some good area damage would be helpful there, and I'm guessing the area is going to be ruined anyhow, so I can cut loose." Nagase nodded. "I'll deal with their leader, test the limits of their regeneration." He turned to Naruto. "Go investigate the blood trail, try to find your teammate. If something comes up, run for the commercial district. By now, most of the people there should have evacuated." Naruto nodded and summoned 4 clones, jumping down to join the 2 Ishi shinobi. "If you need to speak to me or each other, tell one of them, and they'll let us all know." He didn't wait for their reply, but immediately took off, dashing across rooftops in a direct line to the northeast. That's it for part 11. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.